Audio check. Teams audio check. Right. Good morning, everybody. We'll resume the inquiry. No housekeeping matters from us other than just a couple of things about today's timetable. Obviously, we've got the re-examination this morning for half hour or thereabouts, and then the first two witnesses from BAAN, Professor Anderson and Finlay Asher. Just double checking the timings of those witnesses. In both cases, Professor Anderson, in both cases, I've got examination in chief at about an hour and a half, and the cross-examination from the appellants revised to about 3/4 of an hour. I'm getting a nod. Okay, that's great. We should be okay on time, but just a reminder that we do have to adjourn 4 o'clock or thereabouts. This is one of the days when this room is needed for a meeting after that, and it has to be cleaned after we've left. Sounds bad, doesn't it? Anyway, whatever it is we do in here, it has to be cleaned. So I think we should be okay. Anybody else got any housekeeping matters of any description? Nope. Okay. Move over to you then, Mr. Taylor.
So thank you very much. Dr. Hinels, good morning.
Good morning.
I want to start, please, by asking you some questions about MBU. You'll remember you were asked some questions in particular in relation to questions of weight to be given to that policy statement. And in your answers to my learned friend, Mr. Humphreys, you drew a distinction between the words used, the tables, and the budget it allows for. And I just want to clarify, I think you're helping clarifying your answers for the inspector's benefit. Can we start, please, by looking at MBU itself, which is CD 6.4, and turn in that document, please, to page 6. That's 6 of the PDF, page 5 of the printed document itself.
Sorry, CD 6.4.
6.4, I think it is.
Paragraph.
So it's the PDF page 6, and I want to go to paragraph 1.11 to start with.
Yes.
Under the heading, the role of national policy, we see that MBU explains that there are, however, some important environmental elements that should be considered at a national level. The government recognises that airports making the best use of existing runways could lead to increased air traffic, which could increase carbon emissions. And then at 1.12 we see this: we should be using the aviation strategy to progress our wider policy towards tackling aviation carbon. However, to ensure that our policy is compatible with the UK's climate change commitments, we have used the DFT aviation model to look at the impact of allowing all airports to make best use of their existing runway capacity. You see that?
Yes.
And what follows then is an exercise, an assessment exercise in which the document makes certain assumptions about growth, and then determines whether or not the growth of the airport-related growth that it assumes is compatible with the UK's climate change commitments.
Yes.
Now, what were the climate change commitments in place when MBU was adopted?
That's an important point. This was 2018, and that was an 80% cut in CO2.
Right.
Not the 100% cut we now have, including international aviation and shipping.
Okay. So, what assessment is included in MBU as to whether the airport expansion assumptions that it includes are compatible with the 6th carbon budget target and the net zero 2050 target?
There is no evaluation of that, and indeed on table 3, which is the point I was making yesterday, but without the detail, the carbon projections in fact exceed the 37.5 planning assumption, and we now know that that planning assumption has been superseded for sixth carbon budget onwards, withdrawing international aviation shipping within the UK's carbon target. So there was no assumption in this paper or this policy document of the sixth carbon budget.
Okay, if we just scroll through the pages of this document, we see the assessment that's undertaken. There's the big heading, implications of UK's carbon for the UK's carbon commitments on top of page 7 of the PDF, page 6 of the printed document. It looks at two scenarios. It continues through to page 8 of the printed document, 9 of the PDF, local environmental impacts, and then we have the heading policy statement. So it says at 125, as a result of the consultation and further analysis to ensure future carbon emissions can be managed, government believes there is a case for airports making best, I think that should say use, of their existing runways across the whole of the UK. To what extent is the conclusion that airports making best of their should make best use of their existing runways across the whole of the UK, contingent upon the analysis that ensures that future carbon emissions can be managed in this?
So just before we get an answer here, it will, I suspect, have been fairly obvious yesterday that when Dr. Hinnells drew the distinction and said he wasn't commenting on the words, it was the table and the planning assumption that he objected to, and that he didn't use this expression, but he had no problem with the making best use of runways. It's the tables and the planning assumption. It would have been quite clear to you that I stopped cross-examining on that at that point, because I didn't need to go into that. And you know, it would be a little bit unfortunate now if he is being taken to things that in effect go back on that. And we were quite clear, and you will remember I asked him questions about, look, put aside the tables, put aside the planning assumption, as to the rest of it, should the inspectors put full weight on that, and he did accept that. So, you know, obviously, if the question needs to be asked, I suppose it needs to be asked, but I do feel a little bit disadvantaged in that I very clearly stopped cross-examining on the point.
Well, sir, can I just explain? I'm trying to clarify what he meant by when he used the phrase "the words," because we never pursued that in cross-examination.
Well,
so you don't know what words he was referring to, and so I'm trying to see which words we're talking about.
Certainly, I take the point that Mr. that Mr. Humphreys was making, that there was that distinction between the words and the tables. I thought that I knew what we were talking about when we were talking about the words and the tables. If there's some clarification on that, then absolutely let's have it.
Yeah, that's where I'm going.
Yeah,
not quite there, obviously.
No, if we clarify what that distinction is, and if it's something other than what I think we took to mean, or Mr. Humphreys took to mean, we may need to come back to it, but absolutely, yeah, let's clarify it, Mr. Taylor.
Okay. So, Dr. Hinnells, we were looking at paragraph 1.25 on page 9 of the PDF of CD 6.4, where under the heading policy statement it says, as a result of the consultation and further analysis to ensure future carbon emissions can be managed, the government believes there's a case for airports making best, and I think we have to insert use, of their existing runways across the whole of the UK. So the question I asked was, to what extent is the conclusion that there is a case for airports making best use of their existing runways across the whole of the UK contingent upon the analysis to ensure future carbon emissions can be managed?
It's absolutely contingent on the analysis. The difficulty with, and I should have said this yesterday, and I apologise for not saying this, the words are entirely dependent on the numbers, and too often the words get separated from the numbers. It is a liberalised framework, but it is entirely dependent on the numbers. And now that international aviation shipping is within the UK carbon target, that is even more important. When I was referring to the words, I was also referring to the words that say there'll be a future airport strategy, which is presaged by Jet Zero. So we are on the way to a new strategy. And also the words that describe the carbon cap and or carbon price approaches in the document. So the document presaged policy intervention to limit carbon emissions at that time to the 37.5, now to a much reduced budget, still to be determined as part of the budgeting process and as part of the Jet 2 consultation and as part of wider government policy, because aviation plays a part in the carbon emissions within the wider economy. So, in a sense, MBU does not stand on its own. It's part of a policy process which culminates in the new aviation strategy which MBU lays out. And clearly, it does not. It was written at a time when our target was an 80% cut. It does not take into account 100% cut in CO2 emissions, and it does not take into account the sixth carbon budget.
Right. Well, let's have a look at the relationship then between the numbers and the words, as you just put it. In your proof, please, page 22 of the PDF, which is page 19 of the printed version. Paragraph 58, you refer to paragraph 112 of the MBU that we just looked at about ensuring that the policy is compatible with the climate change commitments. We've used the model to look at the impact. And then you go on at paragraph 59 to explain that the scale of expansion tested within MBU and against the climate targets then applicable was relatively modest, you say, and you refer to the tables 1 to 3 in MBU outlining various increases in passenger numbers, the ATMs and carbon emissions as a result of the policy. And you explain a bit further down in that paragraph that the total amount of capacity tested was an additional 8.9 to 11.8 MPPA from the policy, or up to an additional 67,000 additional ATMs. And you refer to what that represented in terms of an increase in carbon emissions in 2050. You explain that resulted in additional policy being needed. You then set out the impact of MBU, in other words, what was tested, in the table above paragraph 60, don't you?
That's right, yes. And to be clear, if we look at table 1 in MBU, the passenger numbers in 2060, the baseline assumption was 409.5 million, and the baseline plus best use was 421. So the difference between 409 and 421, that's the scope that was tested in MBU. That's
Right.
why the numbers are so important.
And at paragraph 64 of your proof, page 23 of the PDF, you explain in your proof that the policy approach in carbon terms was very clearly unambiguously, and then you've got a number of factors set out, including at C, assessed on the basis that MBU would at most deliver between 8.9 and 11.8 MPPA and up to 67,000 additional ATMs.
That's right.
Yeah. Now at page 39 of your proof, just so we can stick with the tables and the numbers, at paragraph 137, under the heading Cumulative Decisions under MBU, you cross-refer to your explanation about the assumptions in MBU and what was tested. And then you refer to a number of other airport developments. And you say in the second sentence there, if 8 MPPA is confirmed at Stansted, and taking into account the proposed developments at Southampton and Leeds Bradford and the likelihood that Luton will go to committee to add an additional 1 MPPA, decisions to consent the additional capacity going beyond MBU have already been made. When you say going beyond MBU, what do you mean?
Beyond the passenger numbers in Table 1 or the carbon emissions in Table 3.
Right. Thank you.
And to be clear about that, the base case assumptions, that the basis of that analysis was that the data that was assumed in the MBU calculations was the subject of a Freedom of Information Act request, and we used the assumptions about what airport capacity would be in 2050, and so, for example, the assumption was that Stansted would be 35, and it now has a consent subject to the courts for 43. So that's taken up an additional amount beyond the base case assumptions that were assumed in MBU.
At the end of paragraph 137, your final sentence there, you say, thus the government needs urgently to review the policy in the light of the 6 carbon budget decisions as well as net zero in 2050. Now, what concluded assessment has there been by government which demonstrates that carbon emissions can be managed to ensure achievement of the 6th carbon budget and net zero 2050 beyond the level of growth identified in MBU?
Well, then we come on to Jet Zero, the consultation, and as we discussed yesterday, Jet Zero does explicitly not cover the 6th carbon budget period, 2033 to 37. It builds scenarios to 2050, but as we discussed yesterday, there are a big number of risk factors for each of the elements that make up the carbon reductions, from efficiency through sustainable aviation fuels through greenhouse gas reductions. Each of those areas has uncertainties, and in combination the uncertainties are profound, and there was no risk analysis about whether the carbon target would be met through implementation of the Jet Zero policy.
I mean, we've seen the exercise in MBU that was done, the assessment exercise, and that's set out in that policy document, a concluded exercise. What concluded exercise is there before this inquiry by government which demonstrates that carbon emissions can be managed to ensure achievement of the 6th carbon budget and the net zero target with a level of expansion beyond that assumed in MBU? What concluded assessment?
There is no concluded exercise.
Right. In the absence of such an exercise, how can one conclude that further airport expansion is compatible, to use the phrase in MBU, compatible with the attainment of the 6th carbon budget target and the net zero 2050 target?
We can't conclude that any additional capacity. Sorry, can you just repeat the question?
Yeah.
To be clear.
In the absence of such a concluded assessment, how can one conclude that further airport expansion is compatible with the attainment of the 6th carbon budget target and the net zero 2050 target?
I don't think one can conclude that it will be compatible, additional airport expansion would be compatible with 6th carbon budget and net 2050.
Right.
And that therefore any additional consent would put the target at jeopardy.
Right, thank you. Let's move away from MBU then, apart from this
So
final.
what I've just waited to the end. I mean, it is clearly a little bit unfortunate that this has developed in the way that it has. And I make no criticism of Dr. Hinnell, so, you know, these things can occasionally happen, but the suggestion is that if government had known about the sixth carbon budget and these other things, it would have developed a different policy. Had Dr. Hinnells not given me the answer that he did, I would have put to him the DfT's letter on Monday relating to the requested review of the airport's national policy statement. During the litigation on that, and indeed after it, a number of parties asked for it to be formally reviewed under Section 6 of the Planning Act. In that, and that document, which came out at the same time as MBU, was based on the same analysis, the government clearly made it very clear that certain things related to climate change had happened since they developed that policy, but they make it clear at the end that it's not possible to conclude properly that any of the policies set out in the NPS would have been materially different had these circumstances been anticipated at the time of designation. In other words, they haven't said that the policy is no longer extant. And I would have put to Dr. Hinnells not only the more recent statements that you're very familiar with about how MBU remains policy, but also that it's clearly government's view, expressed in relation to the AMPS, that policy would not have been different. And, in a sense, I haven't stopped the questions being asked, obviously, and it's ultimately a matter of comment, but, I've made my point, and there's not much else I can do about it.
So can I just respond to that? That the point that this drives at is not what policy should be, not what policy is. It's about the weight that you give to MBU. So my learned friend's mischaracterising the case I'm putting and the point that's being explored here. The document that he's just referred to, I don't believe is even in front of the inquiry. It's certainly not something that I've had an opportunity to take instructions on with Dr. Hinnells before he started his evidence, and I don't know its utility or otherwise. But, if you think I've pursued something improperly, then you can give it whatever weight you desire. But all I've done is to seek to explore the implications of the numbers and their interaction with the words to clarify the answer that was given. And if my learned friend didn't take the opportunity to explore that in cross-examination, well, I'm very sorry, but he had it.
I think I've got one point to come back on, but if, and I would say if the re-examination has strayed a bit from the cross-examination, I don't think it's very far, frankly, and I think, Mr. Humphreys, you can pick that up with your witness at a later stage. But the point I want to just clarify, the document, Mr. Humphreys, that you were referring to, the letter from Monday?
Yes.
We have got that, I'm told. Okay, that's fine.
It can be... It's a DfT letter.
Oh,
it's
the
on
DfT letter, got it, yes.
It's the letter on their website, relating obviously not to this case, but the airport's national policy statement. It was quite widely reported in the newspapers.
Yes, I'm with it, and we do have it. I just haven't made the connection. So let's proceed. As I say, Mr. Humphreys, if there's a bit of straying on this part of the re-examination,
yes,
I
don't think it's sort of straying as such. As just it's more that because of the answers I was given, I accept the words, just not the tables. I just stopped at that point.
I take the point, but I don't think it's, frankly, prejudicial in any way, particularly as you've got your own witness coming up.
My apologies if I was using shorthand yesterday. We did say at the start of evidence that the evidence that was submitted in proofs was taken as read, and it was in the proofs.
Yeah, I've understood. Okay, Mr. Taylor.
Next point, Dr. Hinnells, you were taken to, well, actually you were asked questions about a statement by Grant Shapps from February 2020 after the Court of Appeal ruling on the Heathrow expansion case, and it was put to you, at least according to my note, that statement supported the view that MBU was up to date. I just want to take you to the document so that we can actually see what is said, and then you can give your answer in the light of actually seeing the words used. So it is CD 9.131. There's a very nice smiling picture of Mr. Shapps on page 1. And he refers at the very foot of that page to airports being national assets. Over the page he starts to refer to the Court of Appeal ruling today. There's reference to the Heathrow expansion, what the court has declared. The judgment was complex. We want Britain to be the best place in the world to do business with. And then there's a paragraph that says we fully recognise the importance of the aviation sector. At the very end of that paragraph, it says under our wider making best use policy, airports across the UK are already coming forward with ambitious proposals to invest in their infrastructure. And then there's a paragraph, we're committed to working closely with the sector to meet our climate change commitments. And lastly, there's a reference to it being critical that vital infrastructure projects, including airport expansion, drive the whole of the UK economy. Having looked at that document, seeing the sole reference to making best use in that single sentence at the end of the paragraph I drew your attention to, what statement is there that the making better, that MBU is up to date?
There is no statement that it's up to date, and obviously the following paragraph discusses a whole range of measures, some of which, like sustainable aviation fuels, were discussed in what I described as the words in MBU. Greenhouse gas removal technology and electric net zero planes will all help play their part in decarbonising. So the statement was already looking beyond MBU to the new sustainable aviation strategy, which Jet Zero is the consultation document for.
Right, thank you. Now let's move away from that aspect in MBU generally. You were asked a number of questions about emissions trading, remember that?
Yes.
And you were asked about the UK trading scheme and also Corsia. I want to start with Corsia, please. Now you address Corsia in your rebuttal proof, and there's a heading on page 8 of the PDF, page 5 of the printed document of Corsia, and you refer to a consultation commencing on the 18th of January 2021, and you make 3 points in paragraphs A to C on page 9 of the PDF of your proof. So we can see that there is a consultation. What conclusions has that consultation come to? Do we know?
I don't believe that consultation has yet resulted in a final policy paper.
Right. You refer in paragraph C to a letter from the 30th of June 2021, so this summer, in which the CCC explains its position in relation to the use of Corsia to offset UK carbon budgets. And you quote from that, the ICAO's current carbon policy, Corsia, aims to ensure that most emissions increases above a baseline year, now 2019, are balanced by offsets up to 2035. The 6th carbon budget advice set out our position on credits under Corsia, which is the same as for other credits. They should not be used to meet UK carbon budgets. While Corsia could develop to a point where its offsets are of sufficient quality and additionality to be an acceptable contribution to UK carbon budgets, that is currently not the case.
Indeed.
So it was put to you that Corsia is part of an extant framework. Given that advice from the CCC and given the existing consultation to develop the interaction with the UK ETS, what do you say to that suggestion that Corsia provides an extant framework?
Corsia is a relatively weak framework for ensuring or trying to ensure that growth does not result in additional emissions beyond the 2019 baseline. It has a very different objective from UK policy, and UK policy has to go significantly further than Corsia.
All right. Just so that we can see the extent to which Corsia is of use, let's look at CD 9.135, please. That is, I think, the Jet Zero evidence and analysis document, or it might, hang on, I've just got to find the reference myself. Let me just try, see whether I've got the right reference. Yeah, it's the evidence and analysis document, which I think we've got at CD 135,
136.
136, is it? Okay, sorry. And I'm hoping in that document, if we go to, yes, page 11 of that document, please. On page 11, we've got the first scenario that was examined in Jet Zero. Scenario 1, continuation of current trends. And at 3.6, the report explains that it represents a continual current trends in UK aviation. There's no step up in ambition on SAF or annual efficiency improvements, nor any introduction of zero emission aircraft. This scenario does, however, include a carbon price on international flights which are not currently captured by the ETS, and this will require significant effort and international cooperation to achieve. You see that?
Yes.
And then it goes on to explain in more detail under key challenges at 3.7. While this scenario should be relatively easy to achieve, there are still some uncertainties and deliverability challenges surrounding the assumptions. Firstly, a common carbon price is assumed to apply to all flights departing the UK. However, currently different carbon prices are applied. Domestic flights, flights from the UK to EEA countries, and flights between the UK and Gibraltar are included under the UK ETS, while international flights from the UK or its territories are subject to Corsia, subject to certain exemptions. It says Corsia only applies until 2035, and offset prices are currently much lower than those expected in the UK ETS. So, just so we understand, what date does Corsia run till?
2035.
And so how does reliance upon Corsia, how useful is the existence of Corsia to a decision maker in determining compatibility of airport expansion in the UK now with the 6th carbon budget period, which ends in 2037, or the net zero target in 2050?
It's almost irrelevant in its current form.
Right. Now we can see from what we've read there's a reference to this scenario, including prices reflecting the effect of the UK ETS, as we've just seen in 3.7. If we go on in this document to to page 13 of the PDF. Oh no, sorry, we've got to go to the other, the Jet Zero consultation paper itself, which is CD 135, and go to page 13.
Before we do, and apologies for this, the point about scenario 1 is that there are still measures to deliver that scenario at an international level about, as you point out, about pricing carbon rather than valuing carbon. And that scenario 1 graph at page 12 shows emissions climbing to above 50 megatons of carbon. I can't read it exactly at the moment. Right. 55 even megatons of carbon. That's the point. There is significant risk to the policy framework that is being developed at the present time.
Okay, let's go to page 13, please, of CD 135, which is the consultation document itself. And on that page, we can see a graph, aviation decarbonisation scenarios.
Sorry, page?
Page 13 of the PDF of CD 9.135. The actual page number, the PDF page is 13.
They're the same, actually, the PDF page and the printed page.
I should have realised that. Thank you. Okay, we're looking at the graph aviation decarbonisation scenarios, and we've got the do nothing line, which is the top one, and then the second one down is scenario 1, the sort of bluish line, and then that's continuation of current trends we were just looking at. Then I think there's a black line for scenario 2, high ambition. Then we can see where scenario 3 and scenario 4 take us to the light blue, and then a sort of
just to join this with the graph that we just looked at, I believe these are net carbon emissions, whereas the previous graph was gross carbon emissions.
If we go on to the next graph, the scenario 1 graph, continuation of current trends, we've got these kind of triangular wedges on the graph. We can see what they relate to. The dark blue, which results in 5 megatons of CO2 saved in 2050, is headed demand impact of carbon pricing in scenario 1. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, having seen what was said in paragraph 3.7, to what extent does that reflect the effect of the UK ETS and the emissions trading?
That's a difficult question to answer out to 2050. But obviously there's still work to be done on creating, as was pointed out in that previous paragraph, a consistent carbon price.
Right. Let's go back to the evidence and analysis document. Back to page 11 for scenario 1. Under 3.6, there's a table.
Yes.
And there's a row called carbon price.
Yes.
We see the assumption adopted. Carbon price on all flights reaching £231 per tonne of CO2 in 2050 in 2018 prices. And then at 3.7, as we've just seen, they say in the second sentence, firstly, a common carbon price is assumed to apply to all flights departing the UK, but different carbon prices are applied. Domestic flights, flights from the UK to EEA, and flights between the UK and Gibraltar are included under the UK ETS.
Yes.
So how are they included in the assumptions that have been adopted?
Well, they're included with that with that, interestingly, the document uses the term carbon price rather than carbon value. But the carbon values that we discussed yesterday that were assumed in the Jet Zero consultation are lower than the carbon values.
That's a separate point. Let's just focus on the question that I'm asking, Dr. Hinnels. I know this is difficult, but how is the carbon prices for the UK ETS included in the assumptions that we've looked at in the table above paragraph 3.7? How are they accounted for in the assumptions?
So
let's look at 3.7 again. Firstly, a common carbon price is assumed to apply to all flights departing the UK. So there's an assumption about price adopted. How is that assumption reflected in the assumptions in the table above paragraph 3.7? Where do we find it?
We find what they call yes, so the carbon price, as referred to here, is actually a carbon value because it refers to Bayes guidance on carbon valuation. So that's what I was struggling with, the difference between, again, the difference between carbon price and carbon valuation.
I'm afraid you're still not answering my question.
No, I'm trying to work it out. So I'm trying to work it out. So,
Mr. Taylor, you're probably better to move on this.
Okay.
But I think the current carbon prices are around about £50 a tonne, and there is an exemption for a certain portion of aviation emissions that are historical, at least for the next 5 years. But it's not clear what happens in this paper, in these assumptions, between the next 5 years and 2050. That evidence is not available to us.
All right, let's go back to the consultation paper, CD 135, and to page 13. We can see that there are effectively 4 policy interventions graphed out on this graph.
Yes.
Demand impact of carbon pricing, fuel efficiency improvement, zero emission aircraft and SAF, and then there's assumptions about abatement outside the aviation sector, which is the light blue on the right-hand side bar. Now, of those, where would the effect of emissions trading be included?
It would be in the demand impact of carbon pricing, but it would be subject to assumptions about the direction of travel of policy on carbon trading.
Okay, so let's just look at what the government's done then in terms of demand impact of carbon pricing in each of these scenarios. We can see in scenario 1 that element gives rise to a saving of 5 million tonnes of CO2 at 2050. If we flick on to scenario 2, we can see that demand impact of carbon pricing gives rise to a saving of 5 million tonnes of CO2 in 2050.
Yes.
If we flick on to scenario 3,
and this is a different carbon price now. This is a higher carbon price.
Look at the demand impact of carbon pricing.
It's still 5 million tonnes of CO2.
Still 5 million. And then if we look again at scenario 4, we've got 5 million tonnes of CO2 again. So in all 4 scenarios, the demand impact of carbon pricing delivers a saving of 5 million tonnes of CO2 at 2050.
I think the conclusion that you can draw from that is that there is a belief that demand is relatively inelastic to price, except at very high prices.
How compatible is a suggestion that emission trading on its own will deliver compliance with net zero 2050 with this assessment work undertaken by the Department for Transport?
Well, it won't deliver it as currently configured. And as discussed yesterday, if carbon prices went so high, the effect on different sectors of the economy, because it is trading across economic sectors, if carbon prices went so high, the effect on another sector of the economy could be catastrophic, and I don't use that word lightly. You cannot assume the same carbon price across different sectors of the economy without really major economic impacts.
Let's just stick with this document for a moment. I want to take you back to page 13, please, and to the text above the, on page 13, above the graph, it says, we've modelled 4 illustrative scenarios. The proposed CO2 emissions reduction trajectory for aviation from 2025 to 2050 is based on our high ambition scenario, shown in more detail on page 14. So the high ambition scenario is scenario 2,
Yes.
isn't it? And that includes higher ambition for SAF fuel efficiency improvements and different assumptions relating to zero emissions aircraft compared to scenario 1. So when we see that, to what extent is the government, in its consultation paper via its preferred scenario, suggesting that emissions trading on its own will be sufficient to deliver net zero 2050?
Well, it clearly isn't sufficient to deliver net zero 2050, except at very, very high carbon prices.
And what assessment is before this inquiry which demonstrates that emissions trading on its own can be relied upon to achieve the 6th carbon budget target and or net zero 2050?
There is no assessment.
If we go back, please, to the evidence and analysis document, and I want to take you, please, to I think it's page 7. With a bit of luck. Yes, page 7, paragraph 212. Markets and removals. At 212, the department in the supporting report say that market-based economic measures will play an important part in reducing emissions from the aviation sector in a cost-effective way. Schemes which place a price on carbon via tradable permits or offsetting obligations will increase costs to airlines. Airlines are likely to pass at least some of these costs on to consumers in the form of increased ticket prices, and this may reduce demand for air travel, depending on the scale of the price increase and how price-sensitive customers are. And it explains there's likely to be variation between long-haul and short-haul passengers, with short-haul flights passengers tending to be more price sensitive, and different airlines may make different decisions about the extent to pass on the costs. You mentioned a moment ago about the potential effect of using emissions trading increasing price. If the government were to rely upon emissions trading alone, what would be the likely consequence for demand for air travel?
Well, no, once again, this is improper. We dealt with forecasting in topic 1. As I asked Dr. Hinnells at the end, he's not the forecasting witness. I discussed with Mr. Foley and other witnesses and Mr. Brass the price of carbon in the emission trading scheme that is assumed in his forecasts. We also have a slower growth forecast, which assumes, through the Monte Carlo modelling, higher prices. Those are prices of carbon in the emission trading scheme. That's not within Dr. Hinnell's purview as a witness. He's a witness on carbon, not forecasting. And we dealt with this, and we can't use, sir, with respect, this as an attempt to undermine the evidence that was given in that first topic. That's just, really not appropriate, and it was discussed.
So it's no such thing. My learned friend's confusing the forecast for demand for expansion at Bristol Airport with the questions I'm asking are about the demand for travel generally. I'm talking about what happens to the overall demand in the UK for travel if emissions trading alone is used to address the carbon issues.
Well,
it's an entirely different issue.
But again, as Dr. Hinnell's accepted, when I asked him yesterday, it was one of the last questions, you're not a forecasting witness. No, I'm not. Now, he may say there will be an effect on carbon price. We know there's an effect on carbon price. We've modelled it.
Well,
but it's really not for Dr. Hinnell's to give evidence on forecasting. He knows nothing about the level of demand, the elasticities of demand. He made the point just now that it seems that demand is inelastic to rising prices. This is just not his area.
Yeah, Mr. Taylor, I think I'm rather with Mr. Humphreys on this one. We all know that there's a considerable overlap between the topics, but Mr. Humphreys was very clear yesterday that he wasn't going to pursue matters of forecasting, and it seems to me that your re-examination is straying into that area.
All right, I'll ask a different question.
Sure.
Dr. Hinnells, what assessment have you seen of the impact on demand for travel in the UK if the government were to rely upon emissions trading alone to deliver compliance with the 6th carbon budget target and the net zero 2050 target? Assessment of that, please.
I haven't seen an analysis about carbon trading alone, and I'm not sure that there is one. But I think that that's something that, given that we had new carbon values published last week, that we can take that away, and we've got 3 weeks to do a note on that.
No, there must be no misunderstanding of this. The carbon values, as you accepted in cross-examination, are not the carbon prices.
Sorry, that's not what I accepted. Sorry, that's not what I accepted.
Hold on, there is a line in the sand here. I am very keen. This inquiry has gone on for a very long time. We've had a lot of evidence. Everything's been dealt with very thoroughly. That just because the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy produced something on carbon values to be used in Green Book assessments of government interventions, that is then suddenly taken as a proxy to reopen the debate on carbon prices that we had in topic 1 and reassess forecasting, which is not your area.
No, I'm sorry, but carbon...
One at a time, and this time it's me. I'm 100% with Mr. Humphreys on that. The response that we have asked for, I've forgotten the date now, in a couple of weeks' time, is specific to that document, and that document, in about the 2nd or 3rd paragraph, I think, from recollection, explains explicitly what it is about. I'm sure they won't, but if any party submits evidence based on that document that goes behind it, then we will simply reject it. It's that straightforward. So let's be absolutely clear on that. I'm with Mr. Humphreys on this one. Mr. Taylor.
So can I...
No, Dr. Hinnells, if you wouldn't mind.
Mr. Taylor.
Sir, we've got that document. We will provide you with a note of its implications for the evidence that's been provided.
Absolutely.
And that is all you want, I think. It's going to go no further than that.
Precisely. Thank you.
We've understood the point and the purview of the materials to be provided.
Yep.
All right. I think I've got my last question, Dr. Hinnells. If it's the case that neither MBU nor the Jet Zero consultation paper demonstrate that airport expansion is compatible with the 6th carbon budget targets. What evidence is there that the inspectors can rely upon to conclude that the expansion of Bristol Airport would not have a material impact upon the ability of the UK to meet the 6th carbon budget targets?
There is no evidence that the inspectors can rely on.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks
Thank
very
you.
much. Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Hills. It's 25 past. We've got to do a certain amount of witness and probably advocate moving. Why don't we take a break now until 1:45, and then we'll move straight on to the next witness.
So, I'm going to disappear upstairs, so this area will be available.
Yeah. I will,
Sir, might I sit where I am and my witness sit there?
I'm quite easy about it. I mean, we obviously need the witness up here.
Yes.
If you're okay there, then fine. Mr. Taylor will still disappear upstairs, but yeah, no, absolutely fine. But
Thank
yeah,
you.
let's break till 1:45, and then we'll start off with your first witness.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Right, let's resume then, please. Mr. Holmes, straight over to you.
So thank you very much, and good morning. Sir, you'll see that Professor Anderson has taken his spot. Can I just check, Professor Anderson, that you're comfortable, you've got everything you need, you've got a nice internet connection, you're all ready to go?
Microphone.
And that you've got the microphone on.
Okay, is that better? You
great.
can hear me clearly.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir. The one thing I should have checked and I didn't. The microphone is on. May I introduce Professor Anderson, please, to the inquiry. This is Professor Kevin Anderson, and his expertise and experience is set out in paragraphs 1.1 to 1.3 of his proof. He currently holds a joint professorship in energy and climate change at the School of Engineering at the University of Manchester, the Centre for Sustainability and the Environment, and at Uppsala University, and the Centre for Climate and Energy Transformation at the University of Bergen. Prior to moving into academia, he was an engineer for a decade, principally in the petrochemical industry. He's examined a number of issues around energy and climate change for many years and has been a member of the Tyndall Centre, which is the UK's leading interdisciplinary and academic climate change research centre since 2001, serving as both its director and its deputy director. He's the author of many papers and reports, and he gives a list in his proof of evidence. And he has also, over many years, given written and verbal scientific evidence to a range of parliamentary committees, various government departments, which he sets out in his proof of evidence, and at the various party conferences, and also to NGOs and civil society groups. He was the scientific advisor to both the Welsh Government's Climate Change Commission and the Scottish Government's Climate Assembly, and he's been doing work in Sweden, which he sets out at the end of that paragraph. He attended both weeks of the Paris Climate Conference as a scientific observer, that was COP21, and has scrutinized the Paris text and was commissioned by Nature to provide his evaluation of the Paris Agreement. And he comes to this inquiry to give his evidence on behalf of Bristol Area Action Network. Professor Anderson, you've provided the inquiry with your proof, with a supplementary proof, and with a set of appendices. Is that all still the case to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Indeed it is, yes.
There's one element which we flagged to the inquiry some time ago, one erratum that we'd like to bring out. That's in paragraph 6.1.3 of your proof of evidence on page 28. And you'll see kind of 4 lines from the bottom. There's a reference there to the Bayes guidance and a 1.9% multiplier. And we flagged to the inquiry by email, as I say, some time ago, that should just mean, that should just read 1.9 multiplier. I know that percentage has irked you a lot. So if anybody could just scratch out the percentage there, that was just a typo. So as I understand the way that examination in chief has been done, although Professor Anderson provided a summary, I'm not going to ask him to read anything out. I'm going to take everything as read, and I'm just going to take him to various bits of his evidence about which I'd like to ask him a bit more. I'm very grateful. So, Professor Anderson, can we please go into your main proof of evidence? You set out at your section 2 your various headline conclusions. I'm going to take those as read. And then in your section 3, you set out your evidence about the IPCC's 1.5 degree report. And you inform the inquiry at your paragraph 3.3 about the difference between a warming of 1.5 degrees and a warming of 2 degrees. And you've also, in your supplementary proof, provided further evidence based on the recent IPCC report. Now, everybody here at the inquiry agrees about climate change and its impact and its importance, and that it must be taken into account. So I know you don't want detailed evidence about that. But, Professor Anderson, is there anything about the IPCC's analysis of climate change or more generally about the importance of climate change that you particularly want to flag to the inspectors what to think about when they make their decision?
I think the key take-home message from all of the science that's been conducted by the IPCC right back to its inception in 1989, 1990, is that it's the total amount of emissions that matters when we're thinking about the impacts of climate change. And those impacts of the exacerbation of extreme weather and so forth, and all the other things that we're aware of, and that are often captured in this sort of sense of a temperature. So the temperature change that we see does not relate to what happens in 2050 or in isolation 2040. It relates to the total amount of carbon dioxide we put in the atmosphere. These are often referred to as the total carbon budget, not 5-year carbon budget, it's a total carbon budget, or sometimes referred to as cumulative emissions, because the emissions accumulate, particularly of carbon dioxide, in the atmosphere. And what that tells us from the science that is absolutely key is it's the immediate to near term that really matters if we're to deliver on avoiding dangerous climate change as captured in right back from the UNFCCC Article 2 in 1992 right through every single major international negotiation since. So it's total emissions that matter. What happens in 2050 in isolation is pretty much irrelevant from a climate change point of view.
Thank you very much. And in fact, you've anticipated my next question to you, which was about your paragraph 4.1 in your proof of evidence. So that's on your page 12, where you do talk about cumulative emissions. And of course, cumulative in science and cumulative in planning is slightly different. And you've just explained to us about the accumulation of emissions. So I won't ask you any more about that. In the rest of this section, you, in paragraphs 4.4 to 4.6, you set out the work that you have done based on the IPCC's budgets and calculating Paris-compliant budgets for developing and developed countries, and setting out the difference between those two regimes. You talk about in your paragraph 4.6 your climate policy paper, which develops a Paris-compliant budget for the UK from 2020 until the end of the century, and you explain a little bit about that in your proof of evidence. Just to be absolutely plain, are you asking these inspectors to apply those budgets, your budgets, the IPCC's budget?
No, not at all. Those budgets and that framing that I've outlined here in some detail, it is to provide context to the Committee on Climate Change's net zero and sixth budget reports. So this provides a context within which to understand the Committee on Climate Change's contribution and the wider policy framework.
Okay, you do in fact say that at your paragraph 4.7. You say that it's an important context into which to understand the position under the CCC. What do you mean by that? Just explain what the important context is.
Well, the Committee on Climate Change have developed a series of sequential 5-year budgets that we're all, I think, very familiar with. These budgets do not directly relate to the temperature thresholds in the Paris Agreement or indeed any other negotiation. They are based and developed from the Committee on Climate Change's interpretation of what they see to be highest possible ambition. So that's their framing that allows them to develop their 5-year budgets. They do not, and they have not, in either the Net Zero report or indeed the sixth budget report, they have not considered what would be necessary to deliver on the temperature thresholds that are outlined in Paris or indeed in the more recent G7 communication. So there is a distinction between those two, but there is not that what I'm suggesting here counters the Committee on Climate Change's position. We are both doing different things, but we are both using a cumulative approach to say, actually, it is the pathway that matters, not what happens in 2040 or 2050 in isolation. So we both have that as our framing, cumulative emissions and the pathway that is key, but we are both developing those with a different framing. Mine is based on temperature, and theirs is based on highest possible ambition.
Take up, could you please, Mr. Osmond Ireland. Now that's the way I've been pronouncing his name in my head, Osmond Ireland. Is that right? Osmond. I'm terrible with pronouncing names.
Certainly when I've said it like that, he hasn't strongly objected.
I'm very grateful. So can you please take up Mr. Osmond Ireland's rebuttal proof, please? So not his addendum, but his rebuttal proof.
Okay, that is CD.
It's not a core document.
Okay.
It's separately
That's right.
in the proofs section. And yes, I know you're testing your technology by using...
testing my ability with the technology.
Yes.
I'm sure the technology that should be fine.
So it's in the proofs section on the website. Be under the evidence.
Which is it? Would you want the principal evidence of the rebuttal?
The rebuttal evidence, it's BAL/6/3.
Yep, okay.
And you'll see there at page, well, his paragraph 3.2.2,
3.2.2.
which is on page 11.
Okay.
He takes from your evidence that you disagree with the UK's carbon budgets, and he makes the point, well, they're the budgets that are enshrined by law. What's your response to that?
He's wrong on the first part and right on the second. Just to clarify, I'm not disagreeing with the budgets, and they are obviously the ones that are enshrined in law.
In 7, in your main proof of evidence, you make the point there, or in one of the later paragraphs, about the budgets, the CCC's budgets, being a minimum for what is required.
Yeah, absolutely, that's the case. They're the absolute minimum that policy should be aiming to deliver.
Let's move on then to the CCC's carbon budgets. And you, at your paragraph 4.8 in your proof of evidence, address the emissions that are required with the first 3 carbon budgets, culminating in a 37% reduction below 1990 levels. And you say that we are currently the United Kingdom, are currently off track for meeting the 4th and 5th budgets, respectively a 51% and a 57% reduction. So the UK is currently not on track to meet its own domestic targets. Now, let's just look at that in a little bit more depth. So can we look, please, at core document 9.78. 9.78. Which is a Bayes document. It is the updated energy and emissions projections. Do you have that?
Yeah, I do indeed, yes.
And can you go in that document, please, to both actual and PDF page 14?
14.
14, 14.
Okay.
And
Yep.
you'll see there's figure 2.2.
Yeah. Yes.
Can you please explain what's going on in that figure?
Okay. So, fortunately, it's quite a simple graph, which is really helpful here. You can see in the bottom the different carbon budget periods, and you can see the little blue and black lines, and the black lines are the actual carbon budget that is the underpinning assessment from the Committee on Climate Change, and the blue lines are their assessment of either where we are or where we are heading in terms of our current their assessment of our current projections. And what you can see in Carbon Budget 3 is that we are broadly in line with that, and indeed the following table captures that numerically. In Carbon Budget 4, we are falling significantly short. We are projected to fall significantly short of Carbon Budget 4 period, and still further fail on our Carbon Budget 5 period. So it demonstrates a significant difference between the policy framework as the Committee on Climate Change understand it that we have today, and their assessment of what is necessary to deliver on the net zero framing that is now enshrined in law.
Well, I'll come back to that and look at that in a little bit more detail. I just want to ask you about the next page, because you talked about things being captured in numerical form on the next page. So that's page 15. Can you talk us through that table, please, and how what you've just been looking at is captured in numerical form?
I think just for brevity and actually simplicity, the important part to look at there, because I think the previous plot does a really good job of explaining this, is the final line called cumulative result versus budget. I think that's the important one there. And you see three numbers, minus 26, 162, and 415. And these are the absolute either shortfalls or indeed in Carbon Budget 3, we're slightly exceeding what the Committee on Climate Change said was necessary, but by some very marginal amount, so really within the noise. But basically, we're delivering on Carbon Budget 3. That's their assessment. We're falling short by about 162 million tonnes in Carbon Budget 4, and that increases significantly to 415 million tonnes, not far off 500 million tonnes by Carbon Budget 5. So it demonstrates that we need to very significantly tighten policy if we are to deliver anything like the carbon budgets, and which I would argue are the absolute minimum that we would need laid out by the Committee on Climate Change.
Okay, so that's very helpful. Certainly for my mind, sometimes I see a minus and I see a plus and I think, plus is good and minus is bad, but now I understand it's the other way around on that table, so thank you. All right. Can we then go back in your proof of evidence, please? You can close the Bayes document. Can we go back in your proof of evidence, please, to paragraph 4.10. Where you talk a bit about the carbon budgets and the sixth carbon budget. And you talk about the fact that the sixth carbon budget period is 2033 to 2037. And then you talk about the impact of that on previous carbon budgets, so the ones that we were just looking at in those tables. And at the very end of that paragraph that you say that the sixth carbon budget requires a 78% reduction below 1990 levels of all UK emissions, which includes emissions from international aviation and shipping. So you talk about, later on in your proof, 4.11 and 4.12, this kind of 4/5 cut in emissions. So just explain, first of all, what that means and what the importance of that is.
Well, it demonstrates, if you follow the Committee on Climate Change's approach, and which, is, as I say, is now embedded in law, that we need to make very dramatic reductions in our total emissions, by the mid-2030s. And that it does include international aviation and shipping emissions. That's in the sixth budget report. And the implications of that are that actually you have to do something very significant in the preceding budget periods, because you cannot suddenly deliver that from, if you like, from a standing start. And so it has implications, significant implications, for the levels of reductions that are going to be necessary in the preceding carbon budget periods. Because those preceding carbon budget periods, which I've laid out in the evidence here, and I think we're familiar with anyway from Mr. Hinnell's evidence, is that they do not expressly include emissions from international aviation and shipping, which the sixth budget does. Nevertheless, the Committee on Climate Change were aware of course, the emissions from international aviation and shipping, and did think about that when they were plotting the assessments, or giving the assessments for carbon budget 4 and indeed carbon budget 5.
Yes, and you do explain to us in your paragraph 4.11 what the Climate Change Committee itself has said, and you give a reference there to the CCC's report, that's CD 9.34. I think I won't bother to go there. I'll just take it from what you say in your proof of evidence, that the CCC has made the point that this pathway implies a reduction compared to the per annum pathway set out in the fifth carbon budget. So there's an additional 66 million tonnes of CO2 emissions reductions which are needed under the fifth carbon budget.
Indeed.
So when we were looking at the DBA's document just now and how far away we are from hitting the fifth carbon budget, what's the impact of what the CCC has now said that you quote on that?
The impact is that for every sector, it is going to be incredibly difficult to deliver the carbon budgets as outlined by the Committee on Climate Change and as now enshrined in law. Let's just repeat that. For every sector, it is going to be very difficult to do that. And we may go into this later, but the implication of that is that there will be virtually, well, I would go further than virtually, there will be no wriggle room for any sector to expect to be able to offset or pass on its emissions burden, emissions reduction burden to another sector. Every sector is going to be struggling. And almost by definition, that we are heading in a direction that the Committee on Climate Change, as careful analysis points out, is going to fall wildly short of the budgets that are necessary. That, by definition, says that every sector is struggling. So I think that's, to me, that's a really important piece of information in the jigsaw here, is that every sector is going to find it very difficult to reduce emissions in line with what I would say are the minimum commitments as laid out by the Committee on Climate Change.
You then go on in your proof of evidence to talk about what the CCC has said should be done, and you talk about, in your paragraph 4.17, its approach historically to aviation. I'm going to talk about headroom and the 23 number a little bit later, so don't worry, I'll come back to that. I want to ask you about something slightly different at this point, which is that at paragraph 4.18 of your proof of evidence, you flag the fact that the CCC and the government indeed have been chary of demand management in the aviation sector, but that the CCC's sixth carbon budget did reflect a limitation to passenger growth and did assume a certain percentage, and over the page, on your page 20, that it specified in its advice to government no net expansion of airport capacity. What do you understand by net expansion?
That overall, there can be no expansion in the UK's airport capacity, collectively amongst the airports in the UK. And I think, if I may, and I'm happy not to carry on if you prefer me not to, but I think it is worth pointing out that the reason that I would deduce, and indeed from the discussions with the Committee on Climate Change on this point, the reason there has been a significant shift in the sixth budget compared with the fifth and indeed the fourth and previous ones in relation to this concept of demand management is because they have, in their careful analysis, they have clearly come to the conclusion that we are falling far short of what can be, of our commitments, our carbon budget commitments, and that we can no longer deliver that solely through technical shifts, through sort of technocratic changes. These are no longer sufficient. They're a prerequisite, but they are insufficient. And that is because of our failure to really put in the appropriate policy framework. And so the Committee on Climate Change have had really no choice but to add to the mix demand management, constraining capacity.
Can I ask you now to look at your supplementary proof of evidence, because you also address the Jet Zero consultation on that point in your supplementary proof from page 8 onwards. And, I mean, we take as read from what you've said in your supplementary proof, what you say about this is just a consultation, and that those points are all taken as read.
Okay.
But at your paragraph 2.3.2, you refer to the Jet Zero consultation suggesting a pathway not dissimilar to the Climate Change Committee's balanced net zero pathway, but it could be achieved without the government needing to intervene directly to limit aviation growth. And then you refer to the footnote about airports meeting, that the expansion of any airport must meet its climate change obligations to be able to proceed. And then you talk about what those climate change obligations are. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that, given what you've just been telling the inspectors?
Well, we may come back to this later, but I think what is key there is to understand what is meant by climate change obligations in the language and the framing of and the analysis of the Committee on Climate Change. And they lay out a pathway for aviation that is a key part of their overall net zero and sixth budget analysis. And in that, they very clearly show the pathway that UK aviation needs to be on if it's to make its fair contribution to the delivery of the Committee on Climate Change's budgets. And it comes as no surprise to anyone who can do the sort of what is really, in this case, relatively straightforward arithmetic, that those emissions, of course, have to come down in the immediate and near term, because I go back to my evidence right at the beginning, or my comment right at the beginning. What matters is the pathway and the cumulative emissions, not what happens in 2040 or 2050. And the Committee on Climate Change reinforced that by giving a very clear direction as to what the emissions need to look like, the reduction in emissions from the aviation sector in the UK.
You then go on, well, actually, maybe I'll ask you just one more question about that. So when you see the words in that document, climate change obligations, whose obligations do you understand that to be referring to? Whose obligations are being referred to there?
My interpretation of that is that those obligations are those that need to deliver on the carbon budgets laid out by the Committee on Climate Change and enshrined in law. So in essence, I mean other people will know this terrain, this sort of legal terrain, much better than me, but in essence I see that as being, it's the commitment of the Committee of the Secretary of State, but then that is downscaled to regions under MPPF 21 and the MBU, and to councils, and indeed, I would argue, also down to private developments that need to be in line with those climate change obligations. And of course, the council and the planners need to take those things absolutely into account. So ultimately, it downscales from the national level to the council level.
You then go on in your proof to talk about paragraph 2.3.2. You mention what we say, what Sam Hunter-Jones says about Jet Zero consultation and decarbonising transport and their policy approach here in the inquiry. I'm not going to ask you about that. And then in your paragraph 2.3.4, you make the point that I flagged earlier about Jet Zero remaining an open consultation. But this is the bit I want to ask you about because we're talking about demand management. So you say there that it's salient that the Jet Zero consultation does not take demand management off the table. And you note that it was published before AR6, which is the IPCC's assessment report 6. Can you just explain a little bit more about this paragraph, please?
As I understand from my reading of the Jet Zero consultation, demand management remains one of the tools that is available in delivering on the carbon budgets that are outlined, and that's the pathway as well outlined by the Committee on Climate Change. The importance of that, I think, was made very clear in the latest assessment from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, have used the strongest language that scientists are ever able to use to outline the severe situation that we're in. And so IR6, I think, just provides, again, some context as to how severe the challenges are that we face in terms of the impacts of climate change, and therefore to try to minimize those impacts with the levels of mitigation, of reduction in emissions that we require if we're to meet our obligations. So I think that reinforces the Committee on Climate Change's analysis, which says that we require demand management as a complement to technical change if we are to remain within their carbon budgets and indeed within our wider obligations in terms of temperature, 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade.
So back then, please, to your main proof of evidence, section 5, page 21. Oh, it's here. There you give us figure 1, and you talk about emissions peaking in relation to aviation. Can you just explain a bit about that, please?
That figure, okay. The first thing to note on this figure is that I've indexed all of the emissions here, so I can draw a nice comparison between BAL's assessment of their own emissions and indeed the pathway as outlined for aviation by the Committee on Climate Change. And so it allows us to see the very clear divergence between those two pathways. So whilst the Committee on Climate Change are not suggesting as a key part of their analysis that underpins both the net zero report and indeed the 6th carbon budget report, they have their pathway that the aviation needs to follow. And it is clear from this that the BAL emissions, according to their own analysis, fall far short of what's necessary. And I also think it's important to return to the point that it is the area under the curve, it is the cumulative emissions, it is the carbon budget that matters. So not only does it fail on any particular year, it fails year after year after year, decade after decade, 2 decades of failure. And that means that the extra emissions that BAL tend to put into the atmosphere will build up each year from the previous year. And that, again, goes back to my opening comment today, that what is absolutely key is to consider the cumulative emissions. And what is evident from this, just a simple extrapolation or simple interpretation of the Committee on Climate Change's framework and indeed BAL's own estimates of its own emissions, is that huge shortfall between the expansion proposals and what is necessary to deliver on the Committee on Climate Change's budgets.
Thank you. I said I would come back to the headroom and the 23 million tonnes point, and this is the point at which I will do that. So can you go in your proof of evidence, please, your main proof, to page 14, paragraph 4.7. That's where you, not 4.7, 4.17, sorry.
Yes.
Can't read my own very clear text. So 4.17, you give us a little preamble where you tell us that the CCC's historically conferred some special treatment on international aviation, it being technically exempt, but then you explain about how headroom has been allowed for that, and then that's changed from the sixth budget period onwards. International aviation has been brought in to the UK's budget, and so the CCC then envisages 23 million tonnes of CO2 per year being emitted by UK aviation in 2050, and that's down from pre-COVID levels. Now, first of all, can you explain what that 23 million tonnes of CO2 figure is doing? How do we understand that?
That is the total emissions that can come from aviation in the year of 2050. That's the single year, 2050. And so that's the final year of the pathway that the Committee on Climate Change used. It has to be down to 23 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent. And so do you want me to extrapolate on the headroom as well?
Well, no, let me ask you a bit more then about what you've just said about the pathway. So the relationship between the 23 million tonnes of CO2 and the pathway, we were just looking at that table a bit later on in your proof of evidence on page 21, where you've modelled the pathways, both Bristol Airport's and the CCC's pathway.
Just hasten to add, I haven't modelled them.
Oops.
They are both BAL's
Sorry.
model data and that from the CCC.
I knew I was going to be picked up on using loose language. That's what happens when you have a scientist as one of your witnesses. Yes, you haven't modelled them, but they are shown on this table based on Bristol Airport's own information. How does the 23 figure engage with this? Explain that to us.
Well, it is if you looked at figure 1, the best way to understand that really is it's the lower of those two curves. That's the Committee on Climate Change balanced net zero pathway. It is the value that you reach by the time you get to 2050. But that value is there only for that pathway. So if you exceed the pathway, then the value at the end has to be considerably less. And that is because it is the area under the curve that matters. And that is the only thing that matters if we're serious about climate change. Everything else, in the Twitter language I use, is fluff and nonsense. The science tells us it's the area under the curve that matters. The Committee on Climate Change accept that, the IPCC accept that. You know, it is the fundamental premise of our concern about climate change. So the 23 million tonnes has to be seen only in light of that pathway. And if we exceeded the pathway at any point, we have to dramatically reduce the emissions later on. And it may well be quite rapidly the point that you cannot stay within the appropriate budget, and then we simply fail to deliver on the sixth budget report and the framework laid out by the Committee on Climate Change and now enshrined in law.
So then now to move on to the point you wanted to go to, which is about the difference between the 37.5 planning assumption, the headroom, and the 23 million tonnes. And you set this out a little bit in your proof of evidence on page 30, where we get to your drop in the ocean fallacy argument. And I'm going to take that argument as read. I'm not going to ask you more about that, given how clear you make it. But you talk about here the 37.5 million tonnes planning assumption. And then you, in the next paragraph, point out that Bristol Airport, BAL has compared its additional emissions with that planning assumption rather than the 23 million tonnes pathway from the CCC. And I think we now understand a bit more what you're talking about there. I'm going to ask you about what Mr. Osmond Ireland has to say about that, but before I do, is there anything else that you want to explain before I go on to what was said against you?
Okay. Well, at the risk of being accused of being a stuck record, and that won't be the first time I've been accused of that, what, again, as I say, is absolutely key is if we are concerned about climate change, and even if we're concerned more broadly or in line with Paris, or even if we're concerned about our domestic legislation enshrined in law, it is cumulative emissions that matter. So in that regard, if we are to take the CCC's analysis as underpinning government policy, the 37.5 million tonnes need to be completely disregarded. It has nothing to do with the agenda on climate change. We need to follow the CCC's analysis where the 23 is important. And as I pointed out before, the 23 is only important if we follow the CCC's pathway. If we exceed that, then that number would have to be significantly less.
So look then, please, in Mr. Osmond Ireland's rebuttal on his page 30, paragraph 5.2.1.
5.2.1, yes.
On page 30, because he picks up your criticism and he says that it's difficult to understand the logic of your point because 23 million tonnes of CO2 is not the planning assumption that was actually used in the setting of the first to fifth carbon budgets, so there's no need for a planning assumption in the sixth carbon budget as there's no headroom allowance to be taken into account in section 10. What's your response to that?
I think that, well, I think it misreads on multiple levels what it is that we need to deliver and what the Committee on Climate Change have used in its analysis. It's hard to know really how much further to go with that unless I get maybe a very precise question because it's simply just, it appears to me, let's be generous, it appears to me to simply misunderstand what is laid out in the CCC's analysis and the underpinning framework of the CCC's analysis.
Okay. Let's come at it a different way then. Maybe I can do it like this. Can you please find, probably on your desktop, CD 9.37? And the reason, sir, that I've said that it's probably on your desktop is that I think CD 9.37 might be one of the documents that slipped through the net in terms of being available online.
Okay, indeed, I have it here. This is the UK enshrines new target in law to slash emissions by 78%.
Correct. It is a press release.
Yeah.
Have you got it?
I have indeed, yes.
Okay, I'm very grateful. So this, as you say, is a press release that was brought out at the same time as the sixth carbon budget was incorporated, was enshrined in law, as it says. And if you go through on page 3 of 5, sort of in the top half of that page,
okay.
you'll see that it says this: the government will look to meet this reduction target through investing and capitalizing on new green technologies and innovation, whilst maintaining people's freedom of choice, including on their diet. This is why the government's sixth carbon budget of 78% is based on its own analysis and does not follow the Climate Change Committee's specific policy recommendations. Now, In case it is said, on the basis of this, that the 23 million tonnes of CO2 number has not been adopted or is just a policy recommendation that the government might not follow, what is your response?
My first response is this is a press release. And you could then say, well, do we need to say more? It is not policy, and I assume is not something that the planners have to take significant account of. It's a press release.
But given I've asked you to say some more,
Okay,
please
so
do.
if I then went on beyond that, I think it would be reasonable to assume that any reasonable government or Secretary of State that adopted and then put in law the challenging recommendations of the Committee on Climate Change, they would have to have an understanding and a recognition and an agreement with the underlying principal analysis of the Committee on Climate Change. I think you wouldn't just randomly put in law some numbers if you didn't agree with the fundamental tenets of the analysis that underpin that. And therefore, my interpretation is because the 23 million tonnes as part of that pathway is absolutely key to the Committee on Climate Change's analysis, and thereby the net zero analysis, the net zero law, then you have to assume that the 23 million tonnes is the one that stands, not the 37.5. That would be my interpretation of this. I can't see how you could interpret it any other way unless someone was trying to be deliberately misleading.
So we know that the budget, the numbers, as you say, the overall number in the sixth carbon budget has been put into law. And as I understand what you're saying, that's where the 23 million tonnes number comes into play. It's part of that overall number. Have I got that right, or are you saying something different?
No, that is exactly what I'm saying, but I'm not just saying it's as part of it, it's key.
Okay. No, sorry, say what you're going to say.
So it's not
just a part of it.
It's a key part of their analysis. You take out, it's like Jenga. You're taking out a key foundation piece, and the house of cards collapses. I'll be careful with that metaphor, actually. I don't mean to suggest that the Committee on Climate Change analysis is a house of cards. It certainly is not. But a key part of it is that 23 million tonnes and the pathway.
Thank you. All right. We can put the press release to one side. Thank you very much. And can we please look back in your proof of evidence? We're going to start to look at the local carbon budgets that you talk about. So paragraph 6.7.1 in your proof of evidence, please. Because we've been talking about our national carbon budgets up till now. So paragraph 6.7.1 to 6.7.5, you talk about all the work that you've done on developing local carbon budgets. And you set out at your 6.7.5 the North Somerset budget over various budget periods. In the shortest, clearest of nutshells, just explain what's going on here, what you did.
Okay. We have downscaled the analysis that we had in our peer-reviewed climate policy paper for what that would mean for the UK and indeed other developed country parties, as they're called in the Paris Agreement. We've downscaled those emissions to the North Somerset Council region. This has been done on a form of analysis that we've used actually for a long time now, that was initially triggered in, sort of, if you like, officially, because Greater Manchester Combined Authorities, so I think it's 9 councils, wanted us to do that for GMCA, initially under the auspices of Andy Burnham was asking us to do this, but all the council leaders have accepted it was appropriate. So we've taken, again, the UK budget down to GMCA. That method we have we have now made it online so people can use that. And we use that method, which we've also been asked by other councils around the UK to provide that analysis for them. We've used that here for North Somerset Council. And one of the reasons that we've done that here is because my understanding of planning, which I will point out is very simple, a simplistic interpretation of it, is that it is the responsibility of the council to consider environmental issues when looking at developments. And indeed, as I understand it, it is also the responsibility of the council to deliver, and I think the appropriate language is, radical reductions in emissions. And so what we're doing here is providing a context within which North Somerset Council, or indeed anyone looking at what they are doing, can contextualize, can say, well, are North Somerset Council actually reducing emissions radically, as is required by them? Are they seriously taking into account the environmental implications of the developments within their region? And that's why we've got those here. But as I say, this initially was triggered by councils in the UK wanting us to do that. We've also done this for other regions now within some of the other EU nations as well, at the behest of council leaders.
You then give us your conclusions on looking at Bristol Airport's emissions, accruing them to North Somerset Council under the allocation system proposed by Wood et al. And then you give us your conclusion, both in terms of, well, you give us two conclusions. Can you just talk us through them, please?
Would you want me to take to particular paragraphs here?
Yes, so sorry. I'm looking at paragraphs 6.7.6 and 6.7.7. Feel free to, I mean, you can read them out or look at them or whatever you want to do. Just tell us a bit more about them.
What we have done there, because we have used this method to determine what North Somerset Council's carbon budgets would need to be, if it was to align with the Paris Agreement, we've then made a comparison that allows us to contextualize the emissions from Bristol Airport as provided by BAL. And so we were able to look at those and say, well, are they significant, relevant to North Somerset Council's requirement to radically reduce emissions and to take account of emissions in their planning? And what we can determine here is that actually the airport emissions end up being at the airport, and obviously the flying from the airport to and from the airport ends up being a very significant part of the budget, sufficiently so that it would be absolutely impossible in any reasoned sense for North Somerset Council to deliver on its appropriate budgets. And I would also add here, in doing this work, we were quite careful to ensure we didn't deliberately put lots of emissions on North Somerset Council related to the airport that weren't really attributable to them. And we used there a method that comes from a paper that we published a while ago. So how would you look at emissions from an airport? Because quite clearly, lots of people from outside of the council region fly using Bristol Airport. And it would be inappropriate to use what we would argue their cruise emissions and attribute them to Somerset. That would be inappropriate. So we looked at the best data that we have available and tried to take account of who is flying from the airport, how many of those people are from within this region, and in a sense, it's their emissions that are attributable to North Somerset Council. But even when you do that, what becomes very, very clear is that the airport and the flying from the airport is going to take up a very significant part of the budget and make it impossible for North Somerset Council to deliver. And you could look at it a different way and say that actually, if North Somerset Council is to deliver, and it is going to permit this level of emissions from the airport, then that will have, I think it's fair to say, dire consequences for all other sectors, because they will have to rapidly reduce emissions. Remember, it's the cumulative emissions that count, so it's not just what they have to do by 2050. They have to start immediately and dramatically cut emissions. And I think it's worth going back Again, all of these arguments are sort of system level to remind ourselves that already in Somerset, I'm assuming, like most other parts of the UK, we are set to fail on our 4th and 5th carbon budget. So to ask sectors that are already going to have to significantly stand up to the plate to deliver on the 4th and 5th carbon budget, to ask them to go over and above that by some very significant margin to allow the airport to expand, in my view, is not practical and it would not be responsible.
Yes, because you talk about the airport expansion specifically in your paragraph 6.7.7. And you look at the additional emissions from the expansion from 10 to 12 million passengers per annum, which are estimated in Bowell's ES addendum. And you apply that to North Somerset Council, and you say the final column above, that's the table a page earlier. And your conclusion is that by 2040, these extra emissions, is that right? So just the extra emissions consume 82% of the 5-year budget.
Indeed, that is the case. And just let me go slightly further, and I think this goes back to the sort of the argument that I've been hearing for 20 to 30 years now. It is, I mean, I have various forms of words for it, which I won't use today, but it's the sort of 2% argument or the 1% argument that what we do is insignificant. It's an argument that was used by climate deniers going back decades, and it is now used repeatedly by people who want to claim that they're doing something which is in line with our commitments and a genuine concern about climate change, but actually what they're doing is completely counter to that. And the argument often is, in fact, our emissions are incredibly small. That argument, that 2% argument, of course, holds for everything. You know, if you split the sum up into small amounts, you can say the emissions of the UK don't matter, nor do those of California, or Beijing and Shanghai, or shipping, or aviation, or cars in Japan. You can divide something down into enough parts that every single part is irrelevant. But if you add them up, what do you get? You get 36 billion tons of CO2. So I often make the argument it is the 2% argument is the approach of the mathematically illiterate or those that are deliberately trying to mislead. It is not an appropriate way to consider this. So as we point out here, the appropriate context shows that Bristol Airport's emissions are very significant within the region that I think is the appropriate framework for considering them.
Yes, and one or two other things on this before I go somewhere else. So you've explained to us in terms of the how these budgets were derived, and if I understood you properly, these are Paris-based budgets. But we've seen the numbers here in terms of how significant the impact is. What in just from 6.7.7, the impact of just this additional emissions from the expansion? That's what I want to focus on, the additional emissions from the expansion. To what extent would that change if you were thinking about the budgets in terms of what the CCC's approach is? Now, I know the CCC doesn't do local budgets, but you could make some sort of extrapolation. So what would your view be?
Well, it would certainly be less than the 82%, but it would still be very significant. And I think probably the best way to think about this in a contextual framework would be to go back to the earlier figure, worrying when you don't even remember the numbers for your own figures, but it's the one that compares Bristol BAL's assessment of its emissions with those from the Committee on Climate Change. And you see the very distinct difference in 2050 between those two pathways.
Yes, that's figure 1 on page 21.
Figure 1, sorry, yeah. So figure 1, I think, reflects what I'm saying in paragraph 6.7.7, which is that it would be it would have very significant implications if you try to play that out at a local level. Whether you do the analysis that we did, which was expressly about stabilisation of emissions that avoid dangerous climate change, or indeed whether you do it in relation to the Committee on Climate Change's interpretation of highest possible ambition. Both of those suggest that it would be a very significant part of North Somerset Council's budget.
One of the things that has been said by Bristol Airport Limited is that, and you in fact deal with this in your proof. Can you go to 6.9.4, please, on page 41? One of the things that has been said there is that there are no binding greenhouse gas targets at local level, and that was one of the reasons that was given for the approach that was taken. If you don't want to say anything else about this, that's fine, but do you want to say anything else about that?
The inspectors here and others are the experts in planning. As I said before, my relatively simple interpretation is that there is a requirement on the councils to deliver radical reductions in emissions. That, as I understand it, is from MPPF 21. And there is a requirement under MBU for the councils to consider the environmental implications of the developments within their region. And that those two mean that they have to consider what the emissions would be from the airport. And I don't see any way out of that, but I could be completely misinterpreting. I'm just taking the words as they come across to a layperson.
Yes, I think what's being put to you there really is that, that there isn't any, in law, local greenhouse gas emissions budgets. There's a national budget. And so that's what the comparator is. There's a national budget, and Bristol Airport's expansion is a tiny part of the national budget.
That would seem to me to be correct, and any development is a tiny part of the national budget. So I don't think that adds anything to an understanding one way or another. But as I said before, we are trying to provide context within which councils and planners can think about their emissions in relation to their commitments, at least as I see them, under the MBU and MPPF 21.
Yes, and when you say 21, you mean 2021?
Sorry.
Not paragraph 21.
No,
just in
2021. I'm probably getting outside of my realm now, talking about planning.
For the planners amongst us who hear 21 and immediately think of paragraph. All right. One other thing I want to ask you, as we're in this bit of your proof, please. Paragraph 6.9.1 on page 40. I mean, this is where you talk a little bit about this argument that there won't be a material effect on the ability of the government to meet the net zero target because there's no requirement for absolute emissions to reduce for any particular airport. And you've said there, what you've just said here, that any individual project impact will be small, but then you refer to the CCC and you apply that to Bristol Airport. I think we may have covered all of that. Is there anything else you want to say?
I just take us back to figure 1, that figure 1 between the BAL pathway and that of the Committee on Climate Change. And as Mr. Hons pointed out there, it doesn't come down to a particular airport. Nevertheless, my understanding is that because Stansted is now being permitted to increase its emissions, that puts additional pressure on the rest of the aviation sector to cut their emissions, particularly given the huge gap between the fourth and the fifth carbon budgets in terms of what we are heading towards and what we need to deliver. So the situation has got considerably harder. Every time we give another development the go-ahead that's going to increase emissions, even though they often describe it as reducing emissions, but absolutely increase emissions. Every time we do that, it makes it more challenging for every other sector.
Yes, and we'll obviously be addressing later on in the planning terms of cumulative impacts through Mr. Hunter-Jones' evidence, so I'm not going to ask you about that aspect of cumulative impacts. Just to wrap up in your proof, you talk about the fly local fallacy. I'm not going to ask you about that. I'm going to take that as read, and I'm also going to take as read the other critiques that you make of the environmental statement. There's one other thing I want to ask you about in your proof, which is at paragraph 4.12 to 4.14 on page 17. This is where you talk about negative emissions technologies, and you explain the concerns about negative emissions technologies and the science behind them, and the need to be cautious about emissions pathways that rely on negative emissions technologies. Now again, just to be absolutely clear, because you set out, at the top of page 18, a little bit more information about the nature of negative emissions technologies and their embryonic state.
Indeed.
But you recognize that the CCC's pathways do rely to an extent on negative emissions technologies. So what are you saying? Are you asking the inspectors to ignore negative emissions technologies? Are you saying the CCC is wrong? Why are you telling us about negative emissions technologies?
For the inspectors and for other people thinking about these issues, again, it is providing context. I'm not saying the Committee on Climate Change are wrong. I come to, I think, significant different conclusions on the scale that we should rely on. But obviously, we still need to be focusing on the Committee on Climate Change's pathways, which they consider need to include some negative emission technologies and other carbon dioxide removal techniques. What I think it is key for the inspectors, indeed the planners and others people to be aware of here, is that there is a very significant debate across pretty much all of the scientific and technical community involved on issues of carbon dioxide removal, negative emission technologies, nature-based solutions. There's lots of language around this, which often is quite confusing, and even more so when people start to use the acronyms. There is a huge debate about how viable they are and the risks that are enshrined within assumptions that they work at scale. So what I'm trying to do in this paragraph is to say, I think it is important contextually to be aware of those very significant risks that even the Committee on Climate Change acknowledge in relation to these technologies. And that re-emphasizes my earlier point that the absolute minimum that we need to be delivering are the budgets as laid out by the Committee on Climate Change. Because they are reliant on very optimistic assumptions, and if we don't deliver on those, then the situation would be considerably worse. In fact, it would be irrevocable. You could not return from that. And so I'm saying that the planners and the inspectors need to take regard of the uncertainty that is clearly there from in the scientific community, but they need to obviously follow the pathways as laid out by the Committee on Climate Change.
Thank you. Can I then ask you a bit about non-CO2 emissions? And you deal with this from page 27 onwards in your proof of evidence, from page 6.1.1 onwards. And you talk about there being in your 6.1.2, a strong scientific consensus about non-CO2 emissions at altitude having a warming effect that approximately doubles the warming potential of emitted CO2 alone, and you refer us there to CD 9.60. Can we look at CD 9.60, please? That is the 2021 paper by Lee and others, the contribution of global aviation to anthropogenic climate forcing for 2000 to 2018. And can we look in that document, please? There's a lovely looking figure on page 6, figure 3. No doubt the sort of figure you enjoy looking at, Professor Anderson. Can you help us with what this means, please?
I will do my best. What this figure is doing is looking at different levels of warming that are caused by flying, obviously, at altitude. And these relate to different aspects of that. So, for instance, when you fly at altitude or fly at any height, you are going to burn fossil fuels. You are currently burning fossil fuels, so you emit carbon dioxide. So what you can see within, for instance, the second bar from the top there, then it shows, so if the second row, if you like, the second red bar, it shows you carbon dioxide. It talks about carbon dioxide emissions, so basically burning kerosene. And it shows you there, that red bar is the level of warming using the scientific approach of instantaneous radiative forcing. So not CO2 equivalent, not global warming potential. These are all managerial tools. They're not what the scientists ever use. The models use instantaneous radiative forcing, watts per meter squared. So what it shows there is the level of warming that we've had between 1940 and 2018. Now, I think what is key here, if we're going to focus on the basket of 6 greenhouse gases, so the ones that were laid out initially in the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, it is often, I think, misunderstood that actually these additional factors from aviation over and above carbon dioxide are not captured in the basket of greenhouse gases. I would argue that is factually wrong. It is true that the vapor trails, the contrails that we see out the back of the aircraft are not captured in the basket of 6 greenhouse gases, which were in Kyoto, but also, of course, within the 2008 Climate Change Act. But the NOx emissions, which come from when you burn anything at temperature, so whatever you burn, you get NOx emissions. The NOx emissions from the aircraft does have direct impacts then on both ozone and methane in the upper troposphere, so in the higher parts where planes fly. And both of those, ozone and methane, are a basket of 6 greenhouse gases that are embedded in the Climate Change Act and obviously come from the Kyoto Protocol. So if you go to the 4th red bar down from the top, you'll see there the NOx emissions, the level of warming from NOx emissions. And you can see that there's obviously been some significant warming from those NOx emissions, which I would argue are clearly basket of 6 gases emissions impacts. I would also draw your attention to the little black bar with a little line at the end of it that comes out at the end of these red bars. Now, these may be things you're very familiar with, so I apologize if I'm sort of appear to be dumbing this down. I don't mean to. But that captures the uncertainty. And I just think it's worth bearing in mind there's some significant uncertainty in the impact and the level of warming from the NOx emissions. Nevertheless, it is very clear that they're having an overall and significant warming impact. Now, I don't know if you want me to go on a little bit from that. I would then argue, as do this Committee on Climate Change, that these need to be taken account of, but you cannot include them within the carbon budget framework. So what you have to do is consider the carbon emissions related to aviation, and you have to consider, you cannot ignore the other emissions that come out from aircraft. You can't ignore the vapor trails and so forth in relation to temperature, but even in relation to the basket of 6 gases that are enshrined in the 2008 Act, you can't ignore the impact on ozone and methane. And so I think it's incumbent upon anyone who's considering these issues to factor those in. And I was a little disheartened by the, I think, unhelpful and I would argue inappropriate dismissal of these other impacts on warming that is evident in some of the BAL reports.
So let's look at how you've taken it into account, please. And we go back to the paragraph I mentioned earlier, where we've done our little amendment to your proof. That's 6.1.3. Where you use the Bayes guidance and the 1.9 multiplier.
I'm sorry, this sounds slightly pedantic here.
Yes?
And maybe I'm being overly pedantic here. So we don't use them. And in fact, I personally, in our analysis, we have always steered away from the inclusion of a multiplier. But we have always considered these gases, the impacts, separately and that they are important. Nevertheless, Bayes recommend that we do use them. We do use a multiplier, and they actually give a figure for it. Having pointed out the uncertainties, they say we should use the 1.9 times multiplier. So I am not saying that they are wrong or they are right. I'm just stating that Bayes say, and that they recommend that we should use the 1.9 multiplier. And I think it is worth bearing in mind, if you read that paper, which is a challenging paper, but if you read some of the other literature that's been written around these incredibly complex and still, to some degree, reasonably uncertain issues, that's probably the lower end of the multiplier estimates that are there. So it's a fairly conservative reading of the multiplier effect, the level of additional warming.
Just for completeness, for your note, we do provide the 2021 Bayes document. That is Appendix R1 to Mr. Asher's rebuttal. It also refers to the 1.9 multiplier. That's on page 92 at paragraph 8.4.1. Because I think the document you refer to here in your proof, sensibly, because that was what was out at the time, was the 2019 document.
Indeed, that's the case, yes.
Yes, so we've given you the 2021 document, which essentially says the same thing. Okay, we are nearly there. I just want to ask one more set of questions about ETS and Corsia. And to begin with, can we go, please, to CD 9.33. Apologies, I'm going to take a little time to get there. Which is Lord Debon's letter to Grant Shapps about net zero and the approach to international aviation and shipping emissions. And can we start, please, on page 4 of that document, which I think is actually on the page numbering, physical page 2, but is actual in the PDF page 4, if that makes sense. And you'll see there that there's a figure which gives the various pathways. And there's a paragraph which is above that figure which talks about the net zero target. And what Lord Deben says is that the net zero target should therefore be met by reducing UK emissions as far as possible, i.e. not by offshoring them, and by using greenhouse gas removals to offset the emissions that remain. Given any potential to achieve this domestically, the aim should be to meet the target without relying on the use of international offset credits, and the government confirmed to Parliament that this is its approach at that point. And there's a footnote there which sets out the Hansard reference as to the position at that time. I then want to ask you about one other thing in the letter, so take the two things together. On actual page 4, but PDF page 6, there's a set of paragraphs about how to include the international aviation and shipping emissions within the net zero target. And this paragraph appears: the primary policy approach to reducing international aviation and shipping emissions should be at international level, given the global nature of these sectors and the risk of carbon leakage from a unilateral UK approach. Now, taking all of that together, and remembering that it's an issue in this inquiry, the extent to which reliance should be placed on offsetting, and the extent to which an international approach should be taken, what is your response to this letter?
First, that the primary policy approach does not exclude complementary national or indeed regional approaches. So they can work together. Second, having engaged on issues of offsetting for probably 15 years now, and including 2 pieces in Nature on that particular issue, I'm aware that it is fraught with methodological, philosophical, moral, and technical challenges that have not been resolved. In some respects, I think have got even more difficult over the years. So I hold with Lord Devon's comment that we should not be relying on international offsets. They are unreliable. And given that, and given my comment that the primary focus being international does not exclude national and indeed regional approaches, my recommendation, I don't want to make a recommendation to the inspectors, but my information would be that putting together, from my understanding, putting together what is here and what is very clearly the understanding on offsetting, even the best offsetting that we have, that we need to focus on delivering reductions within national boundaries. That is absolutely key if we are to make our fair contribution to either the Committee on Climate Change's interpretation of Paris or indeed mine.
Thank you. You've swept up in that answer a number of other questions I was going to ask you, so I won't. Thank you very much. And we also heard Dr. Hinnell's evidence this morning about the interaction between Corsia and the UK ETS, so I'm not going to ask you about that either. What I am going to ask you about is Mr. Osmond Ireland in his rebuttal says some stuff about your approach to ETS, and I'd like just to get your view on that. So in his rebuttal, please, page 11, paragraph 3.2.3, he picks you up on your language, so paragraph 11, 3.2.3. He says, you say that flights into and out of the EU are not included in the EU ETS, but in fact there is a provision for such flights to be temporarily excluded only until the 1st of January 2024, unless Corsia is deemed to be sufficiently equivalent in reducing net emissions. So what's your response?
Well, particularly having sat through and heard yesterday that what is absolutely key, and say it's interesting to learn how these planning processes work, what is absolutely key is what is rather than what could be or should be, then I think I stand by my original statement that the flights into and out of the EU are not included in the EU ETS. That could be changed in the future. It may not be changed in the future. The EU ETS may be disbanded in the future. But what is today is that those flights are not included. So I think I stand by that, and I'm uncertain as to why it's been pointed out that it was incorrect. And actually, on that point, it's also slightly interesting that I think in paragraph 3.3.2, in relation to Mr. Asher, it's just referring to the rebuttal here points out that Mr. Asher made the comment that EU ETS has already been limited to intra-EU flights only. This is not quite true. Well, that's basically what I had said the same thing as Mr. Asher, and mine was incorrect, and the other one is this is not quite true. There's an interesting use of language here, which is, I think, runs through some of this rebuttal, which I suggest is not there to help clarify the situation.
Moving on then, final point that I'd like to ask you about. Back in your main proof of evidence, please. On your page 24, paragraph 5.10, Mr. Asher, who you've just mentioned, also refers to these issues, and I will ask him something about that. But you pick up in your paragraph 5.10, when you've been discussing Corsia, the significant equity issues at play in relation to flying. So what would you like to say about that?
Well, I'm not sure this has been picked up elsewhere in some of the previous evidence, but at a global level, a very small percentage of the global population fly. But let's focus in on the UK, which is what is important here. And according to the DFT, very approximately 70% of all flights are taken by somewhere around 15% of the population. So it is a relatively small group of the population that do the majority of flying. And I think that equity argument is really important here, because what we're saying is that we should privilege, what is a risk here is that we privilege aviation by giving it additional emission space, in this case, even over and above that the Committee on Climate Change say is appropriate, and that also set against a backdrop where we're already set to fail on our 4th and 5th carbon budgets. So we're giving a significant privileged emission space to a sector that serves a relatively small percentage of the population most of the time. What we often see here, and the language we often hear from those that are supporting this ongoing, or this level of privilege, is they say we mustn't constrain hard-working families flying to Torremolinos. And those of us who are concerned about the demand issues here and say it needs to be one of the tools along with technology also share that view. But it is not the people that occasionally fly to Torremolinos that are driving aviation expansion. It is the frequent flyers who are driving the expansion. And the DFT data makes that very clear. So in considering where we should put our tight and rapidly reducing carbon emission space, our carbon budget, I think it is incumbent on us to think about the equity issues. Every ton we add to aviation, which significant proportion of it which goes to provide the services and behaviour of the relatively high emitters in our society, is a ton that cannot be used for a local business, a school, a hospital, some other industry. It is a zero-sum game. You put a ton into aviation, you take a ton away from somewhere else. And we are already in a huge challenge in trying to stay within our existing carbon budgets. So equity, I think, within the UK is a key issue that needs to be taken account of by local planning.
So thank you very much. Those are my questions. Thank you, Professor Anderson.
Thank you for that
You
grilling.
wait there, as there will be other questions for you.
They will. Yes. Thank you very much, both. Mr. Humphreys, straight over to you then.
Professor Anderson, good
morning.
afternoon.
Oh, afternoon, sorry.
Professor Anderson, I've obviously, as you will appreciate, had to, I've got to cross-examine a lot of witnesses this week, and I cross-examined Dr. Hinnells for a long time yesterday, and I think the inspectors quite rightly are keen that I don't duplicate things, so forgive me if I don't ask you about all of your points. I hope it's taken as read that if I don't ask you about something, it doesn't mean I've accepted it. I'm sure you
Or
understand
rejected
that.
it.
Can we just start with this? It seems to me, but tell me if I'm wrong, that much of your evidence seems critical of, and to some extent seeking to change government policy. Is that fair?
No, I don't think it is.
Okay. Well, that's good. And therefore, can I take it that you do therefore accept the airport policy framework, making best use the airport national policy statement, decarbonising transport, and all those other statements of government policy? You accept them for what they are?
I mean, this is your area of expertise. If they are policy, I accept them. If they are consultations, in my view, they're interesting but not relevant.
Understood. And you've made the point that the development, I think your words, runs counter to meeting climate change obligations and net zero and Paris and so on. I don't want to re-go through all the things I did yesterday with Dr. Hinnells, but can we sort of just agree the headline, which is that the Paris Agreement, whilst obviously setting its long-term temperature goals, which you've talked about, the requirement, or at least the principal requirement on the contracting parties, including the UK, is to declare and then commit to their nationally determined contributions.
Yes, that is correct.
And again, within the within the context of that, there are the 5-yearly cycle of contributions, and those, not in precisely the same years, but match in terms of cycles the 5-yearly carbon budgets within the UK's legislation. The idea of the UK legislation is that it will deliver our nationally determined contributions.
Yes, I agree.
And therefore, when looking at what the UK is doing in order to meet its share of the burden in meeting the long-term temperature targets, the inspectors can look at the carbon budgets, the UK carbon budgets, and the mechanisms available to government in order to deliver those. That would be proper for them to do.
It would, but I may have misunderstood you there. I think you said the long-term temperature goals.
Yes.
The budgets are not aimed at the long-term temperature goals.
Yes, but we discussed, obviously the long-term temperature goals are set out in the Paris Agreement, but those are global temperature goals. As far as contracting parties are concerned, the requirement on them, the international burden on them, is to declare nationally determined contributions to bear their share of meeting that long-term target.
I think there are different interpretations of this. My understanding is that in the NDC, they have to determine their highest possible ambition. And the highest possible ambition is not necessarily informed, I think it should be, but it is not necessarily informed by their interpretation of whether that is a fair contribution to the temperature thresholds outlined in the Paris Agreement.
I see. So this is your interpretation, why you seem to see a disconnect between the long-term temperature goals on the one hand and nationally determined contributions.
Almost, but I don't seem to see that. It is expressly laid out in the net zero report from the Committee on Climate Change, where I think it's important, where they expressly point out that they have moved away from that framework.
Absolutely fine, but in terms of domestic legislation, whatever you may think about unincorporated international treaties, in terms of domestic legislation, we are agreed, I think, that the burden on the UK is meeting its nationally determined contributions, and those are done through the carbon budgets.
Indeed. Can I make one additional point to that?
Of course you can.
And I apologise if I've misunderstood this. Yesterday, you made the comment, and I can't remember the exact language you used, but you basically used the Article 2 of the UNFCCC 1992 as providing the starting point for the legal framework, I think was the language you used, in the UK. And I think it is worth bearing in mind that Article 2, which you, I think you referred to on several occasions yesterday, expressly says that this basically signatories to the convention to the UNFCCC, that those signatories have to have recourse to stabilisation of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. And that has to be seen, as I understood from what you said yesterday, alongside these other supplementary or complementary, perhaps, developments that have occurred over time. And so the dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system, if I understood you correctly, that Article 2 is important, then that has to inform also what we think about today. If I understood you correctly yesterday, I may have misunderstood what you said.
You may have, and I'm not sure, frankly, it matters whether you have or whether you
okay.
haven't. What matters, obviously for these purposes, is the UK's legal obligations domestically. But let's move on from this, otherwise we will become bogged down. As an academic, you can have, obviously, views about our international obligations in treaties. As a lawyer, I'm more interested in the obligations on the Secretary of State and the inspectors.
Yeah, I know, I appreciate that. I just, so I may have misunderstood you. I thought yesterday you were specifically saying that that did provide some significant consideration for, more than consideration for the Secretary of State. And indeed, I would have thought, going back to the idea that under the MBU and under the MPPF 2021, the requirement for radical reductions in emissions and to take account of the environmental impact, that the context laid out in UNFCCC in terms of avoiding dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system was a key material issue to take account of.
You have misunderstood the way I was putting it. I was
I
pointing it
apologise.
out as the starting point for international agreement, which is what it is. But
I just say, in terms of what the Paris Agreement does or doesn't require in legal terms, or what the status is of UNFCCC, I will be making legal submissions because it's a point, obviously, for me. And I'm fascinated to know Professor Anderson's view, but it obviously doesn't constrain my legal submissions on what the text means.
surely. And I think that the view you're expressing to me, and again, I don't want to debate with you the rights and wrongs of it, but I think the view that you're expressing to me is, in effect, the series of arguments that you set out in your, I think it's paragraphs 4.1 to 4, I think about 4.6, where in your evidence in chief you refer to these as the Paris-based budgets, I think, rather than the nationally determined contributions. That, I'm not trying to misrepresent you, I'm just trying to understand and characterize the thrust of the argument, and I think that's what you were referring to by a Paris-based budget.
Yes, indeed, Paris compliant, and quite specifically Paris compliant in relation to the temperature thresholds outlined in the Paris Agreement, and indeed the equity component of common but differentiated responsibility.
Okay. And you then you developed an argument about the UK being off track. I asked Dr. Hinnells about that. We looked at CD 9.78, so I'm not going to repeat that series of discussions. I think the inspector has our position, and obviously has got they will have your position as well.
So I'm sorry, if there's disagreement with Professor Anderson's position, I think it has to be put to him. Otherwise, I'm just going to say that his position was not challenged.
Well, I said at the beginning, then I will say, Professor Anderson, I disagree with all your evidence. It is challenged. I mean, it's a perfectly pointless exercise. The inspectors have made it very clear to me, to us, in the estimates, that they don't want simple duplication of arguments, and in relation to CD 9.78, that's what I'm trying to do, not simply duplicate cross-examination. So you can say whatever you like, but our position has been set out.
So I need to understand whether Bristol Airport's position is that we're on track to meet our carbon budgets, or we're off track to meet our carbon budgets, or whether Kevin Anderson's view that we're on track, given on that document, was right or wrong. I mean, I actually had thought that it was common between the parties what he was putting about that document, but if I'm wrong about that, then I suppose I need to know.
Well, yeah, I think there is an issue here. I mean, obviously, what Bristol Airport's position is set out in their witness evidence. So that's their position, rather than obviously anything that Mr. Humphreys may say. But we do have a point here where we've got a lot, and this isn't a criticism. We've got a number of witnesses giving climate change evidence, and what we certainly don't want is for the same argument to be put to each of those witnesses, because I'm absolutely sure that your witnesses will all, from their different backgrounds, say essentially the same thing. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable approach to take. I certainly don't want to hear cross-examination on points that we've either covered with the council's witness, or that indeed we may be covering with other witnesses of yours.
What I'll do, sir, to try and short-circuit this, but I'm not going to do this for every topic. Professor Anderson, I'll very briefly touch on it with you. CD 9.78 is the updated energy and emissions projections for 2019.
Sorry, CD 9.72.
78. 9.78. You refer to it in your
I was just pulling up the
in chief. I think, and I suspect it was a slip of the tongue. You, I think, referred to it as a CCC document. I think it's a Bayes document, isn't it?
It is indeed. Yeah. If I said that, I apologise. Yeah.
It doesn't matter at all. It's an annual report, isn't it? It's updated every year.
Yes.
And what it does and what it's used for is to test policy interventions to inform government about new interventions. And we can agree that that's how they use it, isn't it? That's how Bayes and government use it.
That is my understanding.
Yeah. And we can see in various places in the document, it makes it very clear. For example, PDF page 12, which is talking about the fourth and fifth carbon budgets that you refer to, third bullet point. Second sentence, the projections take account of policies that have been implemented, adopted, or planned, and where the policy design is sufficiently advanced to allow us to quantify impacts. And we can see when we go through the document, if we look at the footnotes, and obviously this is 2019, that there are all sorts of other policies where government's quite explicit that they haven't included those yet. Yes?
Yes.
What the document tells us is for the carbon budget periods that we are in, i.e. where policy will have been formulated and implemented, we have met carbon budget 1 and 2, and it's expected that we will meet carbon budget 3.
Indeed.
And for carbon budget 4, which is the period starting, I think, 2023, it hasn't started yet. It's very clear from the document that a number of the policy interventions, even in 2019, had not been included in these forecasts. Clean growth strategy policies, for example.
The umbrella framework may not have been included in that language. The policies within them, by and large, were included in the careful analysis of the CCC. So I think the CCC did consider all of the...
I'm not asking you about the CCC. We're just talking about this document and the table. So
but these numbers here are from, these plots here are based on the CCC's analysis. And therefore, I can't think how you could not use the CCC's analysis to comment on the CCC's analysis.
We can see, for example, in the table you took us to, footnote 2, which includes results versus budget with inclusion of clean growth strategy policy. This subset of early stage policies and proposals from the clean growth strategy gives an additional potential reduction over those over those in the fourth and fifth budgets. We can see elsewhere in the document it's very clear that not all policy interventions have quite properly at this stage been included in this.
I think in the range of scenarios that the Committee on Climate Change considered, they were. I agree with you that the overall umbrella language would not have been the language that was used, but that the CCC's expertise and considerable analysis here did not include some of these, what are relatively straightforward policy interventions, I think would be unreasonable. They did consider them, they just didn't consider them within that umbrella language.
No, exactly, and that's why we have things set out here. It's clearly anticipated, and this is, obviously the clock stopped in 2019. This is a 2019 forecast, and we've had policy development since then, haven't we?
We have indeed, and the CCC have made this comment again since then as well.
Yes.
So this is not as if the CCC have said, this is very interesting work from Bayes and others, and we will need to reconfigure. They have reiterated their concern that we are going to fall far short of our fourth and fifth budgets.
This is the latest of these forecasts that we have.
In a similar way, you took me to other documents, and you did yesterday, that are comments by various experts in these fields, either within government or indeed the Committee on Climate Change. I think it is appropriate to say the Committee on Climate Change, who continue to do this work, have reiterated their concern that we are going to fall far short of the carbon budget fourth and fifth budget requirements, irrespective of these additional policy considerations that you are bringing up.
We will come to the Committee on Climate Change, move away from that document, but do you accept, or maybe you don't accept, that further policy interventions each year will inform and update these figures?
Indeed, they will inform and update the figures, and they may get worse or they may get better.
Again, I'm trying not to go over things again. We've obviously recently had the decarbonising transport plan, and also published at the same time the consultation paper on Jet Zero, there's nothing in the decarbonising transport plan, is there, or indeed Jet Zero, to indicate that government has adopted the CCC's balanced pathway, which was one of several pathways that the CCC looked at. They include also headwinds and widespread innovation.
Well, my
If you want to
understanding is that-
take me to the document and tell me where they've adopted it.
No, I'm saying it's my understanding they're simply consultations, and so
Yes.
I'm not sure they are pertinent to this inquiry.
Is there anywhere that you want to take me to that shows me a statement from government that it has adopted the balanced pathway?
It is, I'm not aware of any statement, but I think there was an important caveat there. It is possible they just thought that the headline numbers were interesting and they would adopt them, or it is possible they thought the reasoning behind the Committee on Climate Change analysis was also important, and that's why they adopted it. Right. So I think the implications of what you're saying is that they could simply adopt the output, the conclusion, without taking any serious consideration of the analysis. I think that is if that is what you're saying, I'm not saying it necessarily is, but I think that would be an unreasonable framing of the government's position. I think they adopted the conclusions of the Committee on Climate Change because they broadly agree with the analysis that underpinned it. Okay. And that is about the balanced net zero pathway.
And I mean, the inspectors can form a judgment on this, but
Indeed.
What they should know is that your evidence, the conclusions of your evidence, are based on your assumption that the government has adopted the balanced pathway.
Yes, not necessarily every single dot or cross
Yes.
of the T, but the principal tenets of the CCC's balanced net zero pathway are why the government has adopted the conclusions.
And
if that's not the case,
And if the
I'm very
inspectors,
disturbed.
no, if the inspectors disagree with that, they don't think that the government has adopted the balanced pathway, then clearly it would be right for them to consider the weight they attach to your evidence. That would follow as night follows day.
Not necessarily.
Thought you
And the
might
reason
say
for that is because the conclusions are still important from the Committee on Climate Change's analysis, as well as the analysis itself. And so my evidence also builds on the conclusions of the Committee on Climate Change, as well as the analysis that underpin those conclusions. So I think actually I would disagree with your last statement. I think it misinterprets or misunderstands my position. I am broadly accepting the conclusions of the Committee on Climate Change, which are embedded in law now, and that the analysis underpinning it was a likely, very likely, reasonable framing that the government considered in choosing to adopt the conclusions.
Well, the two conclusions from the committee that the government has adopted, not aware it's adopted any others, are one, the size of the sixth carbon budget, and two, that it should include international aviation. That's accepted. There's nowhere, is there in any government statement that they have accepted any other conclusion?
I have to ask you a question here. I thought net zero 2050 had also been enshrined in law. If you're suggesting it hasn't been, then that's your area, not mine. But I thought net zero 2050 had been enshrined in law, which is clearly after the sixth budget report, the sixth budget period, rather. I'm genuinely interested. Are you saying that actually the net zero 2050 target is not enshrined in law?
Well, I'd have thought that's rather obvious. There's obvious answers to that. We can just look at section 1.1 of the Act. Come on, Professor Anderson.
No,
you can do a little bit better than this, I think.
No,
Look, let's just try and focus on the question that I'm asking, which is, in relation to those recommendations in the sixth carbon budget report, I've accepted that the government clearly has adopted the size of the sixth carbon budget and that international aviation is included within that budget. What I've said is I don't believe, and I've asked you to point me to it if you believe otherwise, that the government has adopted any of the other workings or things within that budget, including, putting to you, it has not adopted the balanced pathway.
I have to come back. I feel you were quite discourteous there before, and I apologise if I've misinterpreted you. But I was genuinely asking, is it the case that the Net Zero 2050 framework has been embedded in law? I thought it was, but you're the expert in this field, so I may have misunderstood this. That's a genuine, serious question I'm asking you.
Hold on a second. We're getting slightly off the process. It's question and answer.
But
there was then a specific question about whether there were any other adopted elements.
And I understand that Net Zero 2050 is adopted, and the sixth budget, as with the fifth and the fourth now, are also part of that, inform that pathway to net zero. So I am disagreeing with Mr. Humphreys. I think I'm disagreeing with Mr. Humphreys, because I think the net zero framing is a key element of government legislation.
Professor Anderson, we know that net zero is part of the legislation. That's, you know, very straightforward. We were discussing the sixth carbon budget. Adopting net zero in 2050 was not part of the sixth carbon budget report. It had already been enacted by then. It was part of the legal background. Now, I genuinely don't think that's very difficult. What I was asking you, and I would be grateful for an answer, is in those other things in the sixth carbon budget report, and perhaps in particular the sort of sub-report on aviation and the recommendation box, others, such as balanced pathway and capping capacity, have not been adopted. There's nothing to indicate that they are part of government policy.
No, I accept that. So the sixth budget report, as part of the suite of things that are going to feed into the net zero legislation, which you point out is enshrined in law, it does not say exactly what those policies need to be, but I return to my point earlier. I think it is, you're probably not doing this, but I think there's a risk that we could end up suggesting that regardless of the analysis, the conclusions were adopted in the sixth budget report. I think that is an unfair characterization of how civil servants and ministers think about these issues. I think they take it more seriously than that, and therefore I think they would have considered the broad analysis of the CCC and the fundamental tenets of the CCC are an important part of the sixth budget conclusions, and indeed the net zero conclusions.
All right. There's a lot in your evidence about the CCC and its various reports. Are we agreed, however, that the CCC's reports are advice to government, they are not policy?
Indeed we are.
And for any part of those reports to become policy, there would need to be some statement of policy or indeed legislation which enshrined the particular point?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Again, and maybe it's a subset of the last point, you've suggested that the 23 megatons in 2015 in the balanced pathway is part of the trajectory through the sixth carbon budget and to net zero. Can we agree that government has not said that?
Indeed, we can, and I just refer, again, rather than us go over and over this point to my comment earlier, I think any reasonable minister will have taken reasoned account of the reasoned analysis by the Committee on Climate Change.
Okay. In relation to the CCC's views on no net expansion of airport capacity, and I'm drawing here a distinction between capacity on the one hand and demand or throughput on the other. I'm sure you understand it. Clearly, capacity, where it is to be provided, needs to be available to meet demand. So, for example, there is very little logic, is there, in having spare capacity at Aberdeen Airport if the demand is for growth is from people in the southwest of England. And therefore, simply saying that there is some overall cap on UK capacity that doesn't reflect where the demand is rising would not be a particularly sensible policy.
No, and I know you're keen to emphasise that the CCC are not policy, and we've agreed on that. But nevertheless, it has to stay within that overall envelope of emissions that the Committee on Climate Change have factored in there. But I also think we mustn't muddle up growth and demand, because demand, to some degree, is an outcome of capacity that we build, and there is a wealth of academic literature that supports that historically. So you build more capacity, and you therefore end up providing an additional incentive to increase demand. They are intertwined.
Yes, this is what you call your predict and provide fallacy. That predict and provide and those issues and induced demand was a very popular concept, particularly a few years ago in relation to providing road traffic capacity. But for airports, Professor Anderson, people don't decide to go on holiday to Spain because there's capacity at an airport. They decide to go on holiday to Spain because they want to have a holiday in Spain. If you don't provide capacity, they may not be able to go on holiday to Spain from that airport, but as we discussed in earlier topics, they may simply then have to travel to another airport.
This is just speculation. They may indeed, but of course they may think that to take their children and all their belongings for a 2-week holiday somewhere to another airport is so challenging, they'd rather have a nice summer in Weston-super-Mare. So I think that sort of speculation is unhelpful in this respect.
It is actually a topic we spend quite a lot of time looking at in relation to socio-economic displacement earlier in the inquiry, but I'll pass on from that. Your concept of Paris-compliant carbon budgets for local authority areas that obviously has no basis in UK law or policy, does it?
No, and it was never intended to be to view in that light.
Would penalise authorities that just happen to have airports, as it would imply that emissions that actually are occurring in other parts of Europe or areas overflown by aircraft are actually being emitted at those particular, in those locations, which is...
No, I would have to say I disagree. I think that misunderstands the method that we carefully put together here. And I apologise if we didn't explain it sufficiently here.
You did touch on this, and I wasn't sure quite what you had done. You did sort of touch on it. So
it is in the evidence, but I'm happy to expand it if it wasn't clear.
I think I'm happy with the answer that there is no legal or policy, UK policy requirement for this, and perhaps leave it at that in my context of trying to keep moving.
Okay, just one point for the inspectors, just to clarify, we did very carefully take account of the fact is that a lot of the aviation from, for instance, this airport, indeed any other airport, is carried out by people who do not live in that region, and we felt it inappropriate to incumbent that region with the emissions from those people. So we very carefully and precisely took that into account, just so the planners are aware.
No, you did make that point. The point I was making was a slightly different one. Do you then attribute to North Somerset emissions from an aircraft that is actually flying over, France and Germany and Greece and everywhere else? In other words, the emissions aren't in North Somerset.
So if the aircraft was carrying people from North Somerset to Rome, for instance, then we would take account of the LTO site emissions and the cruise emissions. If the emissions were, if it was taking someone from Cardiff from Bristol Airport, we would not take account of the cruise emissions within North Somerset Council's region. We would only take account of the LTO emissions. Sorry, the landing and takeoff emissions. Yeah, sorry.
Yes. Okay. Then the drop in the ocean fallacy. Can we just look at your evidence? And you were taken several times to the table at paragraph 5.2. Sorry, the figure at table 5.2.
Yeah, certainly.
And you've compared here the CCC's balanced pathway with the Bristol Airport expansion emissions, and what you've done is you've rebalanced each of them to a 27 index of 100.
Yeah, just index them, yeah.
But what we know is that, in fact, the Bristol Airport emissions of that CCC balanced pathway 100 would be about 0.4%. So if we were to plot it without rebalancing at Bristol Airport, we were to plot the size of the balanced pathway against the size of the emissions from the appeal proposal. The appeal proposal would be a tiny line just above the zero line in this chart, wouldn't they?
It wouldn't be a tiny line. It would be the same thickness of line.
Well, all right, whatever thickness of line.
It would
okay,
be,
a very low
it would be
line.
another appropriate and significant part of that total, yes.
Yes, and even by 2050 on balanced pathway, where the emissions here on the index are down to 60, we know from the BAL evidence that the proportion of that would be to do with the appeal proposal would be about 0.3%.
Yes, just let me emphasise that these are very significant percentages. I think, I've spent 20 to 30 years counting. I'm not saying you're agreeing with it, but the denialists have used this sort of argument. I'm not saying that's how you're using it, but I've spent a long time counting that argument. These are very significant percentages.
Yes, but these are, the percentage I've just given you, about 1/3%, is 1/3% of the CCC's balanced pathway, which you have put forward as the appropriate pathway to get to net zero. And I'm saying even
no,
on
sorry, I have
that
not put it
basis-
forward. The CCC put it forward.
Sorry, all right. You, I thought, were urging us that this was in some way an appropriate figure and that you endorsed it, but I might be wrong.
Yeah, no, I suppose that's where the nuance is important here. So I made the point at the beginning, I thought on several occasions, it's the absolute minimum that we need to deliver.
Okay, but even on that basis, if we rebalanced your chart in the way I've suggested, meeting net zero on the CCC's balanced pathway, this appeal proposal would be 1/3%, absolutely tiny.
I have to say, again, that I think this is a mathematically misleading way to address these issues. It has been used for years by Exxon and others to dismiss the importance of climate change, it is now being used repeatedly by developers. Shanghai emissions, that's a small percent of global emissions, less than that of global emissions. So are Beijing's, so are San Francisco's, so are all SUVs in Germany. You can split the globe up into enough parts to make it that every part is irrelevant. You add all those parts together and you get 36 billion tons. It is misleading and it is inappropriate. And I have to say, I'm surprised that you're using this argument here, because you must have heard, and because I mean, obviously you're genuinely concerned about climate change, as is BAL clearly in its literature. Given that, I think that we are using and reusing the arguments that have been used for years by people trying to deny climate change, I find unhelpful, particularly in 2021.
And
0.4%, 0.3% are very significant proportions.
And does the drop in the ocean fallacy also apply to the, I think it's 15,000 international students at Manchester University? I think the university boasts of the fact that it has the highest proportion of international students in the UK. I think you were reported over the weekend as flying students in from China. Bristol Airport doesn't fly that far.
And I have to say I agree with you completely, and I am in ongoing discussion with our Vice-Chancellor. I think that is a disgrace that we are doing that, and we are actually funding the flights of some of these people coming in. I've been making these comments within Manchester and other universities. I've been making the same sorts of statements, initially against the Exxons, and now against people that always want to argue that their growth is somehow acceptable and everyone else has to compensate for them. I've been making those arguments for 20 or 30 years, and I will make them again today, because that is what you are suggesting to me and the planners again, that we break it down into enough small parts, it's all irrelevant, and the emissions just keep rising, as Bristol Airport is intending to have over the next 20 years, rising emissions against a backdrop of serious issues to do with climate change.
Just two final points. We're sort of close to 1 o'clock, but let's see if we can finish within a reasonable time of 1 o'clock. International offsets and your view about the appropriateness or otherwise of them and the government's view over time. I mean, what we do know is that government has notified ICAO of the UK's participation in Corsia. It's passed legislation, the first stage of implementing Corsia, and it's explained that the second stage of legislation will be passed next spring. Now, you may disagree with whether that's appropriate, but it is right, isn't it, that the inspectors have regard to the fact that that is the legal and policy direction at the moment?
I think from your other comments, no. What happens next spring, I thought you would say, well, what happens in the future is not part of the inspectors' considerations. I thought that's the sort of argument that you'd made. So it is true to say, part of Corsia, and that Corsia is an international framework that is not intended to reduce emissions anywhere near in line with what the Committee on Climate Change are suggesting. What we do next spring, I'm sure will be very interesting, but that's next spring, and for the inspectors at the moment, I assume it's not part of their deliberations.
So where the government have said currently that that is what they're going to do, you don't agree that that should be taken into account?
I agree with your view that we should only take account of policy. It is not policy what they are going to do. Governments have been going to do wonderful things for decades. I agree with you, we should take account of what they have in policy, and that is not policy. And I'm a little surprised, perhaps again, that you're bringing that up, given your strong and I think important contribution that we need to stay and stick with policy.
All right. And the EU ETS, again, you've made the point there that I think it's your point again that well, you shouldn't assume that the EU will extend it to flights from outside the EEA, but it's actually the other way round. It automatically reverts, it has a sunset clause, it automatically reverts to flights from outside the EEA unless the EU actually does something to change that. So on the approach you've just put to me, we should assume, shouldn't we, that it will apply to those flights?
I'm assuming that, again, it will be subject, as previously, to legal challenges. So it may well be that happens. It may well be that it does not. So again, I think we have to be very cautious about what will happen in 2024.
Professor Anderson, I said I'd be 45 minutes. I think I'm over by 2 minutes, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much too. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Mr. Hon, have you got any re-examination?
Sir, I do, and I'm loath to do this because it means that poor old Professor Anderson spends his lunch by himself. But I would appreciate being able to do his re-examination after lunch and have the break.
Yep, that's fine. Any indication at the moment how long that may be? Just thinking of timetabling?
I think I'm looking at about 10 to 15 minutes.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, no problems there. We'll adjourn till 2 o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you.
So you're on your own over lunch. I'm sure you're devastated. Yeah, it's...
As long as we get some food, that's all I wish to do at the moment.